We are live.
All right, is everyone ready? We'll call the work session to order and we'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening. Welcome to the public work session of the Rochester Community Schools Board of Education. To those gathered here in person and to the community members watching at home live, we welcome you. As a reminder, this is a public work session. This is not a public hearing. We do have several ways for the public to engage during our public meetings, however. First, members of the public can request to be on the agenda. Tonight, we have 4 members of the public that have made that request. There's a form on our website for those who are interested in the future, and that is due by noon Wednesday prior to our meetings or work sessions. Second, at the end of the work session, we do have time for public comments. If you'd like to participate, there's a yellow card. The cards are over on the table here to my left. If you can just fill the card out and then you can bring it up to either Michelle or Scott on the end and they'll pass it down to me by the end of the meeting. When you're addressing the board, you'll have 3 minutes to speak. We'll let you know when you have 30 seconds remaining. When addressing the board, please state your name and your relationship to the district. Please address your comments to the entire board and not to individual board members, the superintendent, or other school district employees or members of the audience. Please refrain from behavior that is intemperate, abusive, defamatory, or discourteous, or that otherwise interferes with the orderly conduct and timely completion of the meeting. We reserve the right to exclude from our meeting an individual who engages in conduct that constitutes a breach of the peace. We will not be answering direct questions or responding to comments tonight, but we'll make sure someone follows up with you to address your concerns. In addition, as a show of respect to those in this room and for our school community, we do ask that you please wear a mask, including when you're at the microphone, which is a shared microphone that will be used by multiple people in this room. The public microphone is the one that's over here behind Michelle. On behalf of my colleagues on the board, we're grateful to serve this community and we appreciate your support. Roll call, all members are present, and communications. Item 3.1, Secretary of the Board of Education, Michelle.
Good evening. I'd like to tell you that the Board of Education has received 29 email communications from 15 people since our prior meeting. All of these contacts came through the RCS website and they were received by noon on Wednesday. We received an email from John Pleasant thanking the board for their service. Jackie Tull emailed the board regarding the May 3rd Board of Ed meeting. Meredith McCutcheon emailed the board regarding chat with the board. Debbie DePoe emailed us and expressed her opinion on various topics. Deanna Harless sent 3 emails to the board regarding the May 3rd Board of Ed meeting, an email communication, and to confirm the May 17th work session. Lindsay Simonis emailed the board regarding chat with the board. Laura Cox sent 2 emails to the board regarding the May 3rd Board of Ed meeting. Michelle Chittick sent 3 emails to the board regarding the May 3rd Board of Ed meeting, April accounts payable details, and a date in the detailed report. Lori Baggett sent 2 emails to the board regarding the May 3rd Board of Ed meeting and an article regarding quarantine guidelines. Jennifer Watson emailed the board regarding the May 3rd Board of Ed meeting. Tara Donnelly sent 3 emails to the board regarding chat with the board, the roof at Long Meadow, and ESSER funds. Priscilla Gannon emailed the board regarding a program for autism. Julie Stalker sent 3 emails to the board to clarify a comment that was made at the April 26th meeting regarding reading programs, the May 3rd Board of Ed meeting, and a question she asked at the meeting. Jessica Opfer sent 4 emails to the board to inquire about a survey, the reporting of COVID cases, mitigation procedures, and questions regarding the purchase of the new administration building. Michelle Greenwald sent 2 emails to the board regarding the May 3rd board meeting and expressed her opinions on various topics. In addition, we received 10 emails that did not go through the RCS website and came directly through email. 3 emails were received from Andrew Weaver regarding the RCS logo, a FOIA request, and an email he sent to all RCS employees. Michael Franz contacted the board regarding a roundtable discussion. Sarah Romaine contacted the board regarding district concerns. Charles Blackwell contacted the board regarding a board member. Michelle Chittick contacted us regarding a FOIA request, and 3 emails were received from Lori Baggett regarding chat with the board. And that's the extent of our communications.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda, item 3.2, citizens requesting placement on the agenda. So I have 4 citizens tonight, and I will take them in the order that I have them on my agenda, which is Andrew Weaver, Lori Baggett, Jessica Opfer, and Julie Stalker. When you're speaking, you can speak at this microphone here. You'll have 3 minutes. When you have 30 seconds remaining, my colleague Barb will let you know. So Andrew is first. Sure. Lori Baggett. Is Lori here? Jessica Opfer. I'm sorry? Okay. Okay, go ahead and come to the microphone. Yep, go ahead and come to the microphone. Can you state your name and your relationship to the district when you come up? This microphone right here.
I'm Jenny Deutschich. This is Hunter Deutschich, my son.
Hello.
Jeff Deutschich.
And I'm Jeff Deutschich.
My son goes to Van Hoosen Middle School, his first year back after leaving the district 3 years ago. There you go, buddy.
Hi, my name is Hunter, and I go to Van Hoosen Middle School. I just wanted to share with everyone what happened to me at school last week. Maybe this will help others understand why I went to school with no mask on. On Tuesday, I finally got to actually wear my mask, and classmates were saying,
I finally got to actually wear here.
"Here, what my teachers and
Here,
classmates were
what?
saying."
What? Excuse me?
Excuse
Can you guys hear? Yeah, we don't. I think you need to talk into it. Thank you for instruction. He needs to be heard. His voice is important.
Okay, I just wanted to share with everyone what happened to me at school last week. Maybe this will help others understand why I went to school with no mask on. On Tuesday, I finally got to actually hear what my teachers and classmates were saying. It was the best feeling, and I was happy, but because I didn't wear a mask, I was basically bullied for 6 hours. People yelled at me, made fun of me, and 2 7th graders even asked me to fight them. I did my own personal best that day and ignored and walked away from them. Many teachers asked why I didn't have a mask on and gave me one and said to put it on. I just handed them my letter because it's easier for me so I don't get my words messed up. I talked to Mr. Fairchild, and he said he sent my letter to the superintendent at 8:08 a.m.
I'm speaking for my son because this is too long for him. So we're taking turns to help him.
That's fine.
He said, until my letter gets approved, I have to wear a mask and just take more mask breaks. Mr. Fairchild is amazing. We love him. And I wasn't trying to be rude or unkind, but I said, no, I can't do that. Masks aren't good for some people, and maybe others can't wear them at all for medical reasons, like me. That day in history class, I got to go to the library with my parapro for this class. I felt the teacher didn't want me in her room because I wasn't wearing a mask. The only reason I feel this way is because this has never happened before. It was very odd. On Wednesday, my parents kept me home even though I wanted to go to school. On Thursday, I went for 30 minutes that day. When I got there, I was sent to the office and was told I'll be here all day and my parapro would help me with my work. My mom and dad picked me up immediately. To me, the office means you're in trouble and you did something wrong. I don't understand why I was being treated like this. I didn't do anything wrong. So why was I being singled out for not wearing a mask?
My turn. All right. Yep. We're breaking this up. So I I actually had COVID a month ago. This is my son. And understand we need to be safe and care for others. We stayed home in quarantine for 14 days. 14 days. Instead of the 10
As a
days
positive sick kid.
that wasn't tested by Rochester schools in their
And the doctor
community
told
thing.
us 14 days.
Doctor told us 14 days. We just, the school was trying to get us back at 10 days. My parents wanted to be sure I wouldn't get anyone else sick. The nurse said, if someone is sick from COVID, you can't give it to another or get it for 90 days.
Did you guys hear that? This is what the school nurse told our family. If you have a positive test, you are sick, that you cannot give it 30 seconds. Thank you for the kind gesture. To anybody for 90 days or get it again. All right. So since we need to be cut short, I feel like we need 3 minutes per person because it takes us a little longer. The health department said this was true too. He continued to wear masks to protect others because my husband and I told him to. I know all teachers have or had a choice to get the shot, and kids my age have that choice too. If they want to, and it's up to them what they want to do. I also know on Saturday, people that got the shot can go places with no mask on. Then why can't the students who got their shots go to school with no masks on? Why is my son being discriminated? Because he has a medical exempt no mask form / letters filled out by his psychologist.
Thank you.
Nope.
No,
Nope,
he's
hold
not
on.
done. I'm so sorry. My son's voice will be heard right now. People that are yelling mask up to my son in the hallways, that's a reflection on them and their parents. Has nothing to do with my son or even for this school. And that's why I think teachers in the school district, you can only do so much. There you go, buddy.
This past year has been hard for everyone, but I believe it's time. Time for all students to go to school with no mask on if they want to. I just know the extra daily struggles I've had with wearing a mask, and it's not fair. Others have to suffer. My story is different, but it should be a choice, and no one should judge. Be mean or fight if others think differently. It's time to accept. Please let us be kids and breathe. Thank you.
You would have
Thank you.
Thank you. You would have understood more of the ending if I could have just finished about
Thank you.
masks,
We ap-
about super needs and
We appreciate you
special
sharing your
needs. Yeah.
story. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you. If you could submit that story in writing to us, we would appreciate that if it's
It's
possible.
all on file
Thank
at
you.
school.
Thank you. Lori Baggett. All right, that is fine. In the future, the requests to appear on our agenda are non-transferable. So
Can you show
Andrew,
us where that's
go
in the
ahead.
bylaws? Show us where that's in the bylaws, please.
Go ahead, Andrew.
So my name's Andrew Weaver. I have two sons in Brooklands. Community, this is where we're at, right? It's time that we really have honest conversation. Our superintendent, after the last meeting, sent an email out stating that the meeting was stopped because I took my mask off. He did not reference me by name. And not one board member corrected this is not dishonest statement. If that is not at the basic level, what the Board of Education is supposed to do from an accountability standpoint, there is no debate that that email was dishonest. Zero. And not one board member had a public comment, sent out an email. Yet we've seen emails, we've seen people go to the news about different political topics, the topic of the day, and still, when that email came out from the superintendent that was blatantly dishonest,
Andrew,
not
please,
one of you,
please don't criticize our superintendent.
I'm stating a fact. Are you telling me that that email was not dishonest?
Finish your remarks, please.
You interrupted me. I'm just asking you a question. Was the email not dishonest?
Please finish your remarks. We stand behind our superintendent. The email was not dishonest. Please finish your
And that
remarks.
is why we are recalling them. That statement right there is why we are recalling our members of our Board of Education. An email that was dishonest and they stand behind it. That is their words. So something else I want to share with the community that happened after May 3rd. My wife received a call from a coworker the sheriff, or I'm sorry, the Rochester Police Department liaison officer that was here on May 3rd reached out to another Rochester Police Department officer whose wife works with my wife to find out what they knew about me. Come to find out, the superintendent filed a police report after that board meeting. It is on record. I will make it publicly available for everyone to see. Our district is having district employees spend their time combing through Facebook looking for comments, which is sad because anything I post on Facebook or on social media, I send to the district. If there is one thing I am, I'm probably transparent to a fault. So again, we are spending money to have people look for stuff that I give to them. But why a police report? So I had a conversation with the chief of police. He has apologized for the inappropriate actions taken by his police officer in reaching out and making contact, digging into my personal life, running a lean background check on me when there was no reason to. Why would the district file a police report? Again, when the email was blatantly dishonest, the facts at hand were not true. Why are we using
Time's up.
resources
Andrew,
to
if
go
you can
after
finish up,
parents?
please. Please
This
finish
is
up.
What do we stand for as a community?
Thank you, Andrew.
Like it or not, what I have to say is some of the way I say it.
Andrew, please sit down. Your time's up. Andrew, please sit down. Next up, we have Jessica Opfer. No, I don't think so.
Can I just ask, is it possible to speak into that mic? Because I can't even see half of you.
Is this
And you
mic on?
can't see me.
Is it-
Is that one on? I mean, I'm shoved behind a screen. I can't even address you.
Yeah, we can watch you on we're watching you here. Yep.
No, but
Yeah.
I can't speak from that microphone.
If you can please speak in that microphone, because we do have the camera positioned on you right now for this part.
I know, but I'm
Do you- yeah,
I'm
why don't you-
addressing the board, so it's a little awkward, this thing. Okay. Thank you. That helps a little bit. Can we just move this slightly? Okay. I'm sorry. I just feel like it was a little awkward, so
You might want to position it up just slightly.
there we go. Okay. My name is Jessica Opfer, and I have 2 children in the district. George Bernard Shaw is credited with saying, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." 11 months ago, RCS paid a consulting firm to conduct a phone survey. The district never shared the results of that survey and never explained why it did not conduct a web-based survey that would have assessed a larger audience at less cost. We soon learned RCS was spending at least $1 million to establish the virtual campus, and we were rushed into choosing an educational environment for our kids. The virtual campus was unacceptable for many families for reasons I have outlined here and elsewhere, and we continued to ask for improvements to the virtual campus and a more robust remote learning environment. Charging ahead with the virtual campus created a disastrous rift in our community between those who wanted their kids in person and those who desired a remote environment. But we all recognize the need to address the education of quarantine students. A distance learning committee was formed, but their findings were only mentioned in passing, and we were left with only vague plans for educating quarantine kids. We were told multiple times that the district was developing another survey to assess the concerns of the community, but it never happened. Meanwhile, districts around us have communicated freely with their constituents and surveyed them, in some cases up to 3 times this school year. For the past several months, the district has failed to answer questions about COVID case reporting, including enormous discrepancies between the district's weekly updates, the emails our individual building communities receive, and the OCHD data posted on the RCS website. Finally, at the April 12th meeting, the opportunity for remote comment was removed entirely. The public was completely blindsided by the decision that had clearly already been made in private to spend $10 million to move our administration out of downtown Rochester and into an oversized, isolated office building. Major concerns have since been uncovered about the district's investment in caring steps and unmet maintenance needs at some of our schools, including Longmeadow. Time after time this year, the district has failed to communicate effectively with RCS families and has gone to great lengths to stifle public input in the decision-making process. This board votes unanimously with very little discussion and no open debate. The parents who do speak up feel like we're talking to a brick wall. This is not just a byproduct of the pandemic. RCS has a history of forming committees which meet in some cases over a course of years, whose recommendations are seldom adopted. The district spends hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on public relations and legal services. Has it occurred to you that this might possibly be a symptom of a systemic problem? Giving individuals the opportunity to feel heard is one of the basic building blocks of good communications, but the illusion of listening is not enough. I urge this board to revise bylaw 0153 to incorporate the importance of public input into the decision-making process, encourage dialogue instead of suppressing it by responding to comments at meetings in public, hold true work sessions, town halls, and chats, form meaningful committees, and actually act on their recommendations.
Please finish.
Start
Jessica.
allowing real dialogue to take place between the board, the administration, and the public. You have a lot of work to do to repair the damage done this year. We can do so much better. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Julie Stalker.
Hi, I'm Julie Stalker. I have kids at Hampton. One of my children struggled with reading and used all 3 of your programs. I asked for your help and used outside tutoring. It wasn't until I lost faith in Rochester that my child became a proficient reader. I gave up on the district completely, outsourced heavily, and now I'm the parent of a good reader who loves school and feels bright and capable, like I've always known that they were. I don't want other families to go through what we did. In an effort to fast track students' comprehension of text, RCS's chosen methods of instruction bypass much of the foundation good readers build their skills upon. Reading research has established, and parents like me have seen firsthand, that a systematic, explicit, phonics-based method is effective for all children. Is there a way that such an approach can be offered for our children who do not respond in the classroom? RCS's current approach, balanced literacy, teaches strategies that are the coping mechanisms of poor readers. That the best way to decode and understand new words is by looking at the beginning and the context. Absolutely, context helps you understand meaning, increases your vocabulary and comprehension. But will you really learn a new word, one not in your vocabulary? You can't guess a new word based on context. You can only guess words you already know. When my kids were reading Harry Potter and came across a new word, they looked at the beginning, as they were taught, and made a guess that made sense. But it was the wrong word, and they didn't even know it. Their guesses were so good, I wouldn't know it unless I saw the page. They missed learning new vocabulary words, and they changed the meaning of what they read. RCS teaches 10 different strategies to read a word, like try and lion. Try a word that makes sense, but it can make sense and be the wrong word. Eagle eye says, look at the pictures. That's not reading. Chunky monkey says, look for chunks you know. Well, the word homeowner contains the word meow, but that's not going to help you read it. Teaching the 44 sounds of our language, the letters that represent them, and that we read letters left to right can enable you to read any word in the English language, even ones you don't know yet. The longest word is 43 letters long. I can read it because I was taught to read, not guess. The programs RCS uses are research-based, which means that parts or components of the program are based on practices demonstrated effective through research. Why not use programs that are evidence-based, where the entire program has been demonstrated effective through research? As a public school, it is your duty to teach as many students to read as best you can. We are not the only family who outsources. If you want to be the premier district, please improve your reading strategy so that it is the best and fewer of us need to go elsewhere. Improving the effectiveness of your reading program can reduce the demand and wait list on your interventions, decrease your costs by using interventions that are effective in a small group versus one-on-one. Most importantly, you can teach more kids to read. You recently shared a quote on your Facebook page. Literacy is a moral imperative. I agree, and I look forward to seeing you improve.
Thank you. Next item on our agenda is item 3.3, members of the board. Do any board members have any communication to detail? Michelle?
I had a conversation with Jessica Opfer and we covered many of the same issues she discussed today.
Anyone else? All right, moving on with our work session. So our work session has two topics tonight, both extremely important, both related. Someone's going to need to flip the monitor around, Dr. Shaner or Mike. The presentation that we will see on our monitor here is also reflected here for the audience. And it will be on our website at some point soon after the meeting. Our first item is item 4.1, budget process and oversight. And I will turn this over to Dana Taylor, our deputy superintendent.
Thank you. Good evening. The budget process.
Make sure that's on. Is it on? Okay. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
The budget process is a cyclical one that begins with the adoption of the initial budget, which is typically amended 3 times a year in November, March, and June as actual data becomes known. June is the only time that budgets for 2 fiscal years are adopted, the current year final amended budget and the following year initial budget. Actual financial data is used to forecast through the end of the current year, and the initial budget is based on that forecasted data, adjusted for items such as enrollment projections, funding assumptions, increases in operating costs, things like that. Since every year builds on the one before it, accurate financial data is critical. The district relies on its internal controls over financial reporting to ensure accuracy of its accounting books and records. Tonight, Christy Beakey, the district's Director of Financial Services, and Kevin Kelly, a CPA and the assurance manager with Lewis and Knopf CPAs, will present detailed information regarding financial statement oversight. Christy is a master's level accountant and is a former financial statement auditor of school districts. Kevin is an expert in financial statement reporting compliance. Lewis and Knopf has been the district's financial statement audit firm since 2016. Christy and Kevin will speak about the role of internal controls, the district's financial year-end process, describe the purpose of an audit and the role of the district and audit firm, and the specific levels of financial statement oversight. Please welcome Christy and Kevin.
Thank you. Thanks, Christy and Kevin.
Good evening. Tonight's presentation will share information related to the district's financial statement oversight. As Dana mentioned, historical financial data is a key element of the development of the budget. Since each year builds on the last, we want to share with you how we confirm that our historical data is accurate. The audited financial data for fiscal year end 2020 has been used to develop the budgets that you'll hear about in the next presentation. The final budget amendments for 2021 and the initial budgets for 21-22. Next slide, please, Lori. In addition to explaining oversight of our financial data, this information tonight also builds on that March presentation over internal controls. At that time, we discussed the specific details of controls over each transaction cycle, the monitoring of the controls, and the redesigning of the controls as needed. So all of those transactions that we discussed post to the general ledger as debits and credits throughout the year. And those ending general ledger balances are used to prepare our financial statements as of June 30th each year. So you will hear how internal controls are relevant to the financial statements throughout this presentation. So let me talk through a quick overview of how we prepare for year end, how the audit works, and the required submissions of our financial statement information. In order to prepare for our audit, we have both internal policies and external requirements to provide specific information to the auditor. We start with the balance sheet for all funds. Using a similar process to month end, we prepare work papers and all balance sheet amounts must tie to supporting documentation. We use third-party support whenever possible. That third-party support ensures that our data is more reliable. We tie out all general ledger revenue accounts. An example of this would be a verification of state aid revenue recorded. The state provides a document of all payments for all periods. Our revenue recorded in our general ledger should mirror the state's report totals. We're comparing our data to the third-party information to ensure that all revenue is recorded in the proper period. Additionally, federal revenue must be summarized and reported on a schedule of expenditures and federal awards, sometimes known as a CFA. This is a required supplemental schedule with strict formatting rules that compiles all of the district's federal revenue information. All federal funds received ties back to supporting documentation, such as a grant award letter from the grantor. So once all of our year-end balancers and work papers are completed, they are subject to an extensive internal review process. Our process includes a preparer self-review, a director of financial services review, a review by the executive director of business operations, and a final review from the deputy assistant superintendent of business operations. After that review is completed, the district prepares what's called a comprehensive annual financial report. This includes our financial statement data, along with other governmental accounting standards board requirements and additional statistical information for our readers. All of this is then provided to our auditor. So please welcome Kevin to discuss the audit.
Thank you, Christy and Dana. Again, my name is Kevin Kelly. I'm with the auditing firm Lewis and Knopf. I'd like to first start with answering a few questions. Number one, what is an audit? What is a financial statement audit? And this is an independent opinion on whether the financial statements are fairly stated, and not only to give the independent opinion, but also to indicate whether the district follows appropriate internal processes and procedures for handling the school district's finances. In other words, internal control compliance. Question 2, is an audit required? Absolutely yes. The Michigan Department of Education requires all Michigan school districts to submit an annual audit. Third question, who is qualified to perform an audit? And the Michigan law requires the audit to be conducted by a certified public accounting firm licensed with the state of Michigan. Who relies on our audit? The taxpayers and general public. The Michigan Department of Education regarding state funding, the Board of Education, banks, investors for credit ratings and for bond issues, and others. In an audit process, the management of the district has distinct responsibilities. Those responsibilities include the design, implementation, and monitoring of all internal controls. They're also responsible for preparation and fair presentation of the financial statements that are free from material misstatements. A common misconception is that the financial statements are the auditor's financial statements, but these are in fact the responsibility of the district. The district must also provide the auditor with access to all necessary information. Additionally, the district must have at least one employee that possesses skills, knowledge, and experience to oversee the audit, evaluate the audit, and accept responsibilities for those financial statements. The district must also provide the auditor with access to all necessary information. Additionally, the district must have at least one employee that possesses skills, knowledge, and experience to oversee the audit, evaluate the audit, and accept responsibilities for those financial statements. Additionally, the district is responsible, as Christy mentioned, in preparation of the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, the CFA, in accordance with uniform guidance. Uniform guidance is a set of rules specific for federal awards published by the United States Office of Management and Budget. Additionally, the district is responsible for preparation of the management discussion and analysis. This is a section in the financial statements required by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board to provide analysis about the district's performance, compliance, risks, and future plans. This information is not audited and represents thoughts and opinions of management. The auditor responsibilities are to express an opinion on the financial statements, to conduct an audit in accordance with government auditing standards, and that the auditor must, and those standards require that the auditor must plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable assurance about whether those financial statements are free from material misstatement, and the auditor must be independent from the district. The auditor must assess the skills, knowledge, and experience of management. And from an auditor's perspective, the Rochester Community Schools Business Office is led by an exceptional management team that exceeds the competency requirements. It is unusual to find this level of skill in public school district accounting. The audit includes processes and procedures to determine if a district is required to be subjected to additional audit requirements. If an organization has expenditures of over $750,000 of federal awards in 1 year, these awards are subject to a second Yellow Book single audit requirement. Rochester exceeds that threshold. This audit is twofold: internal control over financial reporting and internal control over compliance. When performing the audit, we first perform risk assessment procedures. This approach is client specific. We base it on discussions with management, the Board of Education, prior financial statement opinions, and current financial data. We assess risk at different levels: the financial statement level and the assertion level. The audit involves performing procedures to obtain audit evidence to support the audit opinion. Some examples of the audit procedures we use are recalculation of amounts, third-party verification, analytical procedures, observation of supporting documents, review of capital projects transactions, test of details and transactions which involve vouching and tracing to supporting documentation. The auditor considers internal controls. We do not provide an opinion on the effectiveness of internal controls, but the auditor must review and understand the district's control activities. And we do this by performing what we call a walkthrough to determine if the controls have been implemented by selecting a sample of transactions and walking them through a transaction cycle. Auditors also evaluate the appropriateness of accounting policies. We evaluate the overall presentation of the financial statements to make sure they are in accordance with generally accepting accounting principles. All these procedures wind up in the final audit report and the financial statements. The district has consistently received an unmodified audit opinion. This is the highest level of assurance possible for the district's financials. Once the audit is complete, there are required financial data submissions that Christy will discuss next. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any board members have any questions at this point of Kevin? Okay.
Next, oh, perfect. So when the audit is complete, we share our financial information with additional groups. There's a presentation to the Board of Education presented by the auditors on an annual basis. We have a November 1st deadline to submit our financial data to the state. We have a data collection form, and that must be submitted to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. This is a federal funding requirement. And we have a voluntary submission to the Association of School Business Officials International. We submit both our comprehensive annual financial report and our meritorious budget award, which is our budget document. So MDE.
Excuse me, Christy, I had a question. The federal audit that you mentioned, what's the timing of that? Does that coincide with when the MDE requires the information from us as well?
So the audit fieldwork is performed. So that's the audit performed on those federal funds,
Mhm.
that compilation of that federal financial information on that CFA report.
Mhm.
So all of that is performed at the same time,
Mhm.
and then everything is submitted
Okay,
just to two different agencies.
gotcha.
essentially.
But they're about this, around the same time?
Yeah.
Okay.
So MDE receives our financial information two ways. That audit report, which is the PDF document, and they also receive some electronic financial data, which we call the FID. So once MDE receives those, they actually reconcile our electronic submission to our PDF report. So they again look at our information and they verify some totals. They look at the revenue totals, those federal, state, and local levels. They verify all of our fund balances, confirm all of our USDA revenues. They look for any transfers to capital projects and debt funds. They also review our pension liabilities and our OPEB liabilities. So because MDE collects our financial data in that electronic format, it's easy for them to compile data to compare multiple school districts in Michigan. So they publish what's called an appendix, a definition of account codes. So that's a requirement for all of the public school districts and charters. We all have to follow the same account code structure. So pretty long accounts, each section means something different. So that MDE takes that electronic formatted data and then creates reports. So just a couple I'd like to share. There's some reports available, Bulletin 1011, which is an analysis of Michigan Public School District revenues and expenditures. There's a Bulletin 1014, Michigan Public School District ranked by selected financial data. So they'll compare us to other districts in Michigan. So Kristen, this is kind of the Federal Audit Clearinghouse piece. So it's required, again, for that federal funds data. This must be certified by both the auditor and by the district. This requires that we report that opinion that the auditors provided on our financial statements. And this, again, is a public database. So our final submission for the district is that voluntary submission that I mentioned. So these documents are submitted to the Association of School Business Officials, or ASBO. This voluntary oversight, oops, sorry, I lost my spot here. This is voluntary oversight, but both of these documents are reviewed by our peers. Awards are given if the review team concurs that the budget documentation and the comprehensive annual financial report meet or exceeds the required criteria. The criteria that it needs to meet is presented as an extensive checklist of all information that needs to be included in our submission. These voluntary submissions are meant to increase the transparency of our district. I'm happy to report that the district has received the award for the MBA since 2018. The only years that were submitted, the award was given, as well as receiving the Certificate of Excellence in Financial Reporting for the 2 years that we submitted for fiscal year end 2019 and 2020. The next two slides just shared for your information. They're the announcements or the award notifications from that agency. So I know we talked a lot about some guidance, right? Governmental Accounting Standards Board, all of these agencies that we submit to. So I shared just a little bit of information for you. There's some links, those checklists that I mentioned for the requirements for voluntary submissions. They're out there, they're available for you guys. But to be honest, with all of this information in all of these different places, it's just as easy to go to our website. So we do have a transparency link. Everything that's on our website, it'll pop up, it'll be a little map. That's also monitored by MDE. So we have specific requirements that we have to put on the website to share with the public. So that's all I have for you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the board? Or comments for Christy or Kevin?
Just one. Kevin mentioned the unmodified audit that you guys do. Do you know how many years approximately our audit has had that unmodified audit finding?
We've been auditing the district since 2016. And it's been unmodified every year.
Okay, so as long as your company has been.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on with our work session. And Dr. Shaner, do you want to set the stage here?
Yeah, I would like to, first of all, thanks for that that presentation, and sorry for the mundane nature of it, but I often say to folks on the phone that, and when I'm speaking to them, that we're in a highly regulated industry, and I'm blessed to work with people like Christy and Dana Taylor and Matt McDaniel and our entire finance team that can keep the district well positioned, not only financially, but also in terms of the auditors, because everyone knows getting an audit's never fun. No offense, but it's an audit by nature. So I really thought we'd be able to lay the groundwork and just share with the board the high degree and scrutiny that our financial statements get. As you know, we continue to work towards a state budget. I was on a call today, and unfortunately, I hate to report that I don't have any end in sight in terms of a state budget. I'd not be shocked if we don't have one until September. Nonetheless, the school district is required by law to submit a budget by July 1st, and we intend to do that. And we have a team of individuals that have worked on this extensively, and we have a budget to present to the board this evening, and a number of amendments as well. I think it's important to note, though, that there's a couple of bills that have passed out of the House, and one of them was an equalization. And it's not law yet, but it's an equalization bill that requires each school district to have an average of 25 hours of instruction retroactively back to April 12th. And I think it's important to note the fact that because we were able to move, even though our organization is extremely large, hastily to get kids back to school, full 5 days a week of instruction with lunch, that we don't have any issues in meeting that requirement. There are multiple school districts, some of which are contiguous to ours, that are struggling to make sure that they get that average of 25 hours actually by today. So the bill says if you don't have 25 hours of average instruction by today, that your funding will get prorated if that budget passes. And again, I say that because I know you sense the frustration in the community, you sense the frustration in the state, and you sense the frustration in the country with the way things move, in the appearance that people aren't doing all they can. I can assure you that this organization, the finance team in this organization, is doing all they can to forecast a financial picture that serves kids. I assure you that this is focused solely on kids and making sure that our staff and our students are well taken care of in an extremely volatile time. Michigan school finance has not been systemic. It has not been equitable, and you'll see that in a little bit, and has not been sustainable for a very long time. What you'll hear tonight is Matt and his team talk about one-time money, which is ESSER or ARP money. We'll also talk about equalization funds,
And you'll also notice from some of the documentation that the federal funds that were allocated were done so inequitably based on a Title I formula that actually counts kids in arrears. So what that means is they're counting kids that aren't here anymore, not in our school district, because we got a very little amount of money comparatively speaking. So I'd just like to set that up. Again, we have to have a budget submitted by July 1st. We'll have our truth and budget hearing at the end of June. We'll ask the board to approve a budget at this point. We'll also ask them to do the final amendment. One of the things that you'll notice about our school district and our organization is we do multiple amendments a year. Many school districts do not do that. They do 1 or 2 amendments a year. But in order for us to forecast to make sure that we're sustainable in a very volatile market, we amend the budget 4 times. So Matt, without further ado, I hope I didn't steal any of your thunder. Dana, Matt, if we could go ahead and present on the budget. And Dana, again, your leadership in this since you've been with the district has been incredible, and we appreciate it. We're in a position that many organizations are not, and we're proud of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaner. Well, every budget year brings its own unique forecasting challenges, and the 2021-22 budget year is proving to be no exception. While the challenge before us includes the rare complexity related to the global pandemic, the district's approach under Dr. Shaner's leadership hasn't changed. His leadership and the leadership of our Board of Education has taught us to concentrate on the things that we can control, to be true to proven processes, and to base our decisions on available facts, not emotions, and to keep communication channels open and active. This approach has served the district very well over time in terms of opportunities for students and staff, in operational efficiencies, financial stability, and in transparency. You may recognize the format of the budget information in tonight's presentation. It's the format we have used to present budget data each of the past 6 years. Matt McDaniel, the district's Executive Director of Finance and Operations and a CPA, will begin the presentation with the district's budget development priorities, as well as the impact COVID-19 has had on budget development. Next, Matt will take us through a very detailed explanation of the recommended final 2020-2021 budget amendments for each of the district's funds, beginning with the general fund, which is the largest of the funds and is the primary operating fund of the district. Next, Matt will present information regarding the initial 2021-2022 budgets. As you know, Michigan public school districts are required by law to adopt initial budgets by July 1st of each year. Oftentimes, revenue and expense data that is material to the district's budget development is unknown until after the initial budget has been adopted. For example, the district's primary source of funding is state aid, which is a complex calculation, but basically it's the blended full-time equivalent number of students in attendance during the spring and fall count multiplied by the state foundation allowance. At this time, the state has not set a foundation allowance for 21-22, and the district won't know the number of students in attendance until after the fall 2021 student count. Another example is employee medical insurance, another large cost for the district. The district's self-funded plan is a calendar year plan. So the increase in illustrative premium rates is not known until many months after the budget has been adopted. Because important revenue and cost data is unknown at the time initial budgets are required to be adopted, the district must decide upon certain budget assumptions to calculate line item budget amounts. There are a variety of external and internal resources to help the district decide which assumptions to use. For example, at this time, state budgets have been proposed by the governor's office, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Typically, one of the state proposed budget is high, one is low, and the other one is somewhere in the middle. While it's impossible to know right now exactly the level of state aid that will be adopted, it will probably be somewhere between the high and the low range. For enrollment, the district relies upon its enrollment office experts, as well as projections from a national student enrollment projection firm. Who knew it? That's the name of the company. Who knew it? Enrollment assumptions are not only important for state funding purposes, it is also critical to set staffing levels. Staff costs comprise about 80% of the district's general fund budget. Matt will present detailed data regarding the assumptions used to develop the 2021-22 budgets, including enrollment data, state aid, federal one-time funding, and costs related to COVID-19, historical foundation allowance levels, and other data applicable to each fund. Please welcome Matt McDaniel.
Good evening to the Board of Education and Dr. Shaner. I would like to thank Kevin Kelly and Christy Beakey for presenting on financial statement oversight. Some of the information that they shared, you'll see tonight. So to start off, why don't we talk about the agenda for this presentation? I'm looking at the agenda. We're going to start off with the final budget presentation. We'll go in order of the major funds, starting with the general fund, as Dana mentioned, capital projects fund, and then the debt service fund, excuse me. Look at non-major funds and then start looking towards next year's budget. And next year's budget, enrollment is going to be a large piece of that. One-time COVID-19 funding, you're going to hear that a lot. The state school funding process, and then we'll look at the actual budgets that are being reviewed tonight. General fund, capital projects fund, debt service fund, and then our non-major funds. All right, so as Dana mentioned with our budget priorities, we've changed these slightly based on the global pandemic. We always work to develop a budget recommendation that contains a balanced and equitable spending plan that is sustainable and promotes growth, minimizes any negative impact on student programs, uses a team-based approach, and provides ongoing communication to promote transparency and openness. COVID-19 has really caused a heightened emphasis on a few different items. One is availability of resources, right? We've heard about that one-time COVID-19 funding. An emphasis on maximizing operational efficiencies, prioritization of highly effective instructional programs and services, cost benefit analysis, and if we're going to use fund balance, to use that fund balance responsibly. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening with the 2021 final amendment general fund budget revenue. Now, as you guys know, and has been mentioned, this is the final amendment that we're going to make this year. So later tonight, we'll present the initial budgets, which, as we've talked about, it is really a best guess, right? We don't know enrollment yet. We don't know what state funding is going to be. We don't know what staffing is going to be in adjusting to that enrollment. So luckily, at this point in time, we have a pretty good idea of what state funding is going to be. However, you'll remember last year in August, there was a $175 per pupil reduction in state aid. Now, fortunately for us, there was COVID money or federal one-time money that the state paid to school districts in a greater amount. It was $350 per pupil. But otherwise, the state didn't have enough money last year when they paid that out in August to cover what the state had promised to school districts in their budget. So to look at the final budget amendment for revenue, we'll talk a little bit about facility rentals. As you know, we prioritize health and safety, and as a result, we closed our facilities to outside rentals for most of the year. Now, some of that has returned. We're allowing some outdoor rentals and a few indoor rentals at this point in time. And that'll probably change next year, but as a result of the pandemic this year, we've had to reduce the revenue further based on the year's results so far. There's also a reduction in local revenue. Tuition-based programs. These programs are, examples are school age care, the pre-K program, enrichment programs. These programs did not get to run at the same level that they normally do outside of the pandemic. The pandemic impacted these programs greatly, as well as the amount of time that students spent in-person learning up until about January when we started to return students. And then there's other fees that are also reduced. Some of these items might be parking fees that we would normally receive from our high school students, but not being able to attend school throughout the whole year. Those parking fee projections needed to be reduced based on actuals. Another piece that's in here, and this is the largest change when we look at revenue is the 450 per pupil ESSER equalization fund that Dr. Shaner mentioned previously. To qualify for this funding, districts must offer at least 20 hours per week of in-person instruction to all pupils beginning not later than March 22nd, 2021, and then submit a spending plan within 45 days. The expectation is that districts must finish their normal, regularly scheduled school year, maintaining at least 20 hours per week of in-person instruction. To note, RCS began offering 31 hours and 55 minutes, which is a full school day of in-person instruction to all pupils beginning on March 1st, 2021. And of course, we submitted our corresponding spending plan. Now you'll remember that March 1st date is when secondary students returned. Prior to that, our elementary students began. And then there's some adjustments to federal revenue and transfers in and other financing sources. There were some late in the year changes to federal revenue that we've encompassed in this budget amendment. So based on that information, let's take a look at the next slide, which shows the financial impact of these changes. So when we look at local revenue, you'll see a reduction of almost $300,000. Again, we've discussed why that's the case. You'll see state revenue, an increase related to the 450 per pupil. Now, to share with you the 450, the district received about 67 per pupil in ESSER 2 funding. So the difference to 450 is that state revenue. Federal revenue, the small adjustments, and then small adjustments also in transfers in and other financing sources. So next, we're going to talk about the projected changes to general fund budget expenditures. At this point in time in the year, we have almost 10 months of data, right? Now teachers are paid a little bit differently. They're paid based on the school year. So we have teachers that are receiving payment in July and August for work that was done in May and June through the normal course of the school year. So some of that data needs to be projected at a greater rate than employees that work year round. For example, our maintenance staff would work year round. We would have 10 months worth of data to project their salaries, but teachers, we still have to consider July and August. So in projecting out salaries and benefits for the entire budget, we'll see increases there. There was also additional compensation related to COVID-19 and the impacts of the global pandemic on the school as well as the staff. There's some reductions in the budget that you'll see. The reduction in anticipated projects. There's a few projects in the business office looking to implement a electronic document management system is one of them. There's some changes and some reductions that we were able to make there. Transportation also saw a reduction. This is mostly in field trips. You know, where we would normally send our students for field trips, we're closed this year. So we didn't have fees for those field trips or transportation to take those kids to those locations. I'm looking at community services. There's two adjustments here for the most part. That's a reduction in salary and benefits. Our school age care program is budgeted here. And there's also a reduction in shared services. So this is where teachers that may provide services to private non-public schools would be budgeted. So there's a reduction there. So when we look at what that does to the overall budget, the expenditure budget, it's a little bit hard to see, but you'll see that throughout the budget, there's mostly increases to each of those categories. I'd just like to remind everyone what those categories are, starting with basic programming. That is our instructional program. That's our elementary, our middle school, our high school direct instruction. It's also summer school and our pre-K programs. Added needs, this is special education, our Title I and 31A programming, as well as Title III and other programmings to supplement the instructional program, as well as our career and technical education. Adult and continuing education is somewhat self-explanatory. And then pupil support. Here is counselors, psychologists, speech pathologists, social workers, occupational therapists, physical therapists, items like that. Instructional staff support is both supervision of, say, the curriculum program or the curriculum department, as well as improvement of instruction, so professional development for our teachers and staff. General administration is the office of the superintendent and the Board of Education. School administration is our building secretaries and our building principals and supplies for their offices. Business support is pretty self-explanatory. Operations and maintenance and security, similar. Pupil transportation and central support is both technology, human resources, items like that. And other support is communications as well as athletics. So now that we've talked about revenue and expenditures, let's take a look at what that does to overall fund balance. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see.
Matt,
Yes.
before you go on, just a quick question on the basic programs and the pupil support where we have an increase. Is that because we made additions in staffing, or how does that adjustment come since those seem fairly large?
Yeah, so most of that is additional compensation related to COVID-19 and the additional responsibilities and duties that teachers and paras and others had to perform related to the pandemic.
So not additional staff, then just additional compensation for.
Not necessarily. There probably are some staff in there, right? That's our largest area of the budget, those basic programs. There's 900 plus teachers or teachers union members. Most of them would be budgeted there in basic programs. All right, so let's take a look at what that does overall. So you'll see the adjusted revenue number, 190 million. The adjusted expenditure number, 192 million for a $1.8 million use of fund balance. Very similar to the overall budget that was presented a few months ago. Any other questions on the general fund budget before we move on to the other funds? I do also want to mention that using fund balance now helps to offset any larger uses in future years. That one-time money is very important, that we can utilize that where we need to support future years of the budget. We'll look at the next budget later on.
So Matt, one of the things I just want to point out for the board, I think there's probably only one board member here that may remember this, but back in the era days, can you just talk a little bit about that, how that one-time money worked, or maybe Dana could step up and talk a little bit about era and about how we've got to be very, very careful about the use of one-time money, and making sure that we're using fund balance in a way that allows us to, sustain our programming as we ride this out.
Yeah, so I think that was maybe 10 years ago, and Dana, you can help me out if you need to. But ARA was, I believe, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that provided additional federal dollars, very similar to COVID-19 funding, when states had some trouble providing the appropriate state revenue levels that they had in the past. So when we look at ERA, we saw in general, and I can't speak to Rochester, what Rochester did because I wasn't here at that time, but you saw that school districts and states would supplement that state revenue that they no longer could provide, right? It might have been here, and now we can provide this with state funding, but there's federal funding so we can keep, or maybe small increases to keep districts and states running at the same levels they were. Well, the problem is federal funding doesn't last forever, right? Our model is really based on state revenue that's there every year that's going to be provided. So when that federal revenue ran out, well, you had a big hole that you couldn't fill because the state didn't make enough revenue to make up the difference. So districts were forced into, and we'll actually look at the foundation allowance. What happened to the foundation allowance? There was a large, I believe it was $470 reduction because the state couldn't afford to pay school districts what they had in the past. So it's very important as we look to the future that the funding that we know that we have, which is one-time funding, can last us throughout as many years as it's available or can be used for, so that the state can either recover to the level that we need it to or typically has, or just to slow the burn of fund balance and use fund balance as needed to maintain our instructional program or the integrity of our instructional program. Dana, do you have anything to add?
They didn't have enough money, so everybody adjusted their budget and programs. And then the federal government came in and gave them lots of money, so we all ended up with like affected on what the state. And then the federal government gave us money, but what happened was by $470. I was in Grand Lake at the time. And what happens then is we have salary schedule freezes. It was 10 years before the staff got a raise. That's how long it took us. That goes through the you'll see that more than our foundation back 2011, 12.
So Matt, when you talk about, spreading out those one-time dollars, you're referencing, for instance, some of that ESSA equalization funding. Is that also something that you're talking about? And coming from the feds, what is that projected out in terms of how long is it supposed to be coming into the state, and when does it end technically?
Sure, and we'll get into this a little bit later on in the presentation, but ESSER 1, 2, and 3 have dates that vary by a year. So I believe ESSER 1 is the end of 22, ESSER 2 is 23, and ESSER 3 is 24. Christie, I might have that off a year, but it's actually one of the slides that we'll go over. All right, so if there's no further questions on the general fund budget, let's move on to the capital projects fund. So we issued Series 2. What was that? 2019 now. So we are coming to the end of the bond program. We are required to spend 85% of Series 2 money, so that 57 million, 56 million, by May of 22. So looking at this budget, there's really just a few adjustments to revenue overall. There's reduction in interest revenue that was generated from cash in the bank. And there's an increase in rebate revenue, which is related to the LED lighting projects that we receive a rebate for, making upgrades to our lighting system that creates efficiencies. Next budget we'll take a look at is the debt service fund budget. Again, very, very similar to the capital projects budget, and that as we look at this budget, we're really at the end of the year adjusting to what we believe will be the actual amounts. So you'll see an increase in local revenue. This is property tax. Again, here, a reduction on earnings and investments, which is interest earned on cash in the bank. And then an increase in other expenses, which is related to taxes abated and written off. Overall, fund balance here will end at 2.5 million, assuming a $200,000 use of fund balance. This debt service fund is what we'll use to pay for the debt payments for Series 1 and 2 on the 2015 bonds or 2016 bonds. And we'll see further adjustments when we look at the next year budget, the 21-22 budget, as debt falls off and we only pay those 2 series. All right, next we'll take a look at the sinking fund budget. Some adjustments here, very similar to the funds that were previously talked about. Negative adjustment, a reduction in interest on cash in the bank, and a small reduction in property tax revenue as well. You'll see reductions to capital outlay. And then the interfund transfer from the general fund and the $3 million loan. An ending fund balance of just under $4 million for the sinking fund. All right, that takes us to the student school activity fund budget. You'll remember that this used to be money that the district held on behalf of maybe the football team or the senior class or NHS. But an accounting change 2 years ago said that this was district funding, and as such, there was a budget required for it. So the global pandemic has impacted operations, and that's a common theme throughout these budgets. You'll see a reduction of 1.3 million in revenue for the school or student/school activity fund budget, right? As the pandemic has limited ability to fundraise and get together and actually fund programming, which could be, new uniforms or any type of senior class activity that would have normally happened. As such, there's also a reduction in revenue, or expenditures, about 875,000. Here, we're projecting an overall use of fund balance of about 200,000, decreasing fund balance to just over $1 million, or 82.21% of expenditures. Next, we'll take a look at the food service fund budget. I'll say it one more time here. Again, the pandemic impacted this budget. While we served food to students all year long, we did it in a very different environment for parts of the year. So you'll see a reduction in local revenue to only about $13,000. Now, this would be a la carte items that our food service program would sell. This would also be, breakfast or lunch charges for students that were required to pay. Excuse me. As you know, this year lunches and breakfasts are free for all students, so that revenue has been reduced. There's also been an adjustment to state revenue, bringing that reduction of about 37,000. However, federal revenue has increased, mostly related to the fact that the federal reimbursement has increased and students are in buildings and taking advantage of the free breakfast and free lunch. Our most recent claim, based on April meals served, is going to bring in about 450,000 in federal revenue, which is, I think, the largest number that I ever saw on a food service claim. When we look at expenditures, you'll see reductions there, but small reductions, right? As I mentioned earlier, we continue to serve meals to students throughout the pandemic all year long. And, we would have costs for that. We'd have salary and benefits for those food service workers. We'd also have the costs of food. And this ends up with a $300,000 loss of fund balance, or use of fund balance, excuse me. But this is something that we've been budgeting for and have been required to do. So over the last several years, we've talked about a finding that we get from our audit that says you have too much, your fund balance is too large at the end of the year. Federal law requires that fund balance does not exceed 3 months of your operating expenditures. So we've been reinvesting in our facilities. We've upgraded kitchens and cafeterias throughout the district. And we've been able to touch all 3 high schools. And we're looking at other facilities, elementaries and middles, to continue to upgrade. Though we have done that since we started receiving this finding, that to get in compliance with that, we've upgraded walk-in refrigerators and freezers at some of our elementary schools, and we'll continue to reinvest in our programs and our facilities to continue to spend down this.
Matt, could you just talk a little bit about the process of that, or Dana, about how you have to submit your plans to the state, wait for approval, and then go through the process in terms of food service equipment?
Yeah, so as this is federal funding, it's highly regulated. So after, as Christy mentioned, after we submit our financial statements and submit the financial information database, or the FID, we'll receive a finding after a few months from the Michigan Department of Education saying you exceed your fund balance, you need to submit a plan. So we'll have to submit a plan of how we anticipate spending down that money. So we might say, for example, when we upgraded the cafeteria and kitchen at Adams, we would say we're going to make improvements to the Adams cafeteria and kitchen, and you'd put in your estimated amount. So once that was completed and you're able to show that you were going to spend down that money, you would submit that to MDE, and then you would receive approval. Now, that's not the only thing you have to do. Now, once you get into the actual work that needs to be done, if you're bidding out projects, you need to not only bid it like we normally would, but you also need to submit that to MDE for their approval before you can start work on that project. MDE also questions your calculation of costs. For example, they don't allow a cafeteria to be fully funded by the food service fund typically, right? They believe that there's other uses for a cafeteria outside of your breakfast and lunch, that maybe it's used for, I don't know, a practice during the day or after school. Maybe it's used for a parent meeting or a PTA meeting. So they won't allow us to fully use that funding. So they'll also take a look at our calculation for how we're going to break down that funding. And you'll also need to find an alternative source for that. Say 90% could be food service fund, because we believe a cafeteria is used 90% of the time for breakfast and lunch. And then 10% would have to come from another funding source, whether that be general fund, capital projects fund, sinking fund, some other item. And then once you get approval, then you can start the project. And at the end of the year, as Kevin mentioned, right, that might be one of the things that the auditors come and look at. MDE also can perform an audit on those records as well, to ensure that you spent the money according to how you said you were going to. All right. Our next fund that we're going to look at is the bookstore fund. A reduction in revenue of about 56,000, again, related to the pandemic and the impacts of not being in school, not able to run the school store at the same level we were, or even for most of the year. So reduction in revenue, a reduction in expenditures of 48,000 that coincides with a reduction in revenue. That support services other, that's really where all the charges for your items that you're selling at your school store go. That could be food, that's your t-shirts, that's your hats, that's those items. And then there's business, which we saw an increase. So our school stores reacted to the pandemic by offering either items online, so doing online sales, or they stopped taking cash. So there's increases in charges for the bank fees related to using a credit card or debit card. And then finally, you'll see an increase in building improvements. As I mentioned earlier, there was a project that the food service fund paid for at Adams High School. And they redid the flooring at Adams in the kitchen and the cafeteria. And the school store is in the cafeteria and wanted to have similar flooring or the same flooring as the rest of that area. Well, we can't pay for that with food service fund. So the bookstore used some of their fund balance to pay for the flooring at the Adams bookstore. A use of fund balance right now anticipated about $18,000, reducing fund balance to $58,981. However, still on a reduced year, about 100% of expenditures. All right, and then the final non-major fund is the Caring Steps budget. So as we look at the Caring Steps budget, you'll see that we've amended this budget not as many times as the general fund, but over the course of the year, there's been one other amendment. And as we look to the final amendment, you'll see that there's an increase in local revenue. Local revenue is the tuition charged to families. And some adjustments to state revenue and federal revenue, just to code these items correctly according to as Christy mentioned, the pupil accounting or the school accounting manual that defines how we record transactions. You'll also see that there is a reduction in the transfer from the general fund, decreasing it from about 300,000 to about 280,000. And then some increases in instructional staff support and operations and maintenance costs for, an offsetting entry from the general fund of 280,000, zero fund balance at the end of the 2021 school year. Are there any questions on these funds before we start looking at next year's budget?
Any questions or comments from the board?
Thank you. So next, we're going to start looking towards next year. And as you know, enrollment is a large portion of how we're funded at our per pupil membership blend. So we wanted to start by just looking at a little bit of history. So we pulled the state of Michigan live birth rate and approximated population based on the birth rate. So as you can see, in general, live births in 2005 totaled 127,518. And in 2019 was only 107,000. So over the course of that time period, we saw a drop in about 20,000 live births. The population overall has either decreased or held fairly steady, but the birth rate has declined. So when you look at 2015, that's when students would start enrolling in kindergarten in 2020, right? When you're 5 years old, as of September 1st, you may enroll in kindergarten, and between September 1st and December 1st, September 2nd and December 1st, you can enroll in kindergarten in a waiver. So most of those students born in 2015 would be enrolled in school, and you can see what impact the birth rate may have on future kindergarten classes as we look forward. Next, we'll look at overall enrollment history. So we pulled this data from both My School Data and the Center for Educational Performance and Information, DS 4120, which is really just our fall count numbers. That's what that report is. So as you can see, when we look at enrollment history for the state of Michigan, that there's been a reduction. It's decreased every year since 2010-11 school year. However, when you look at the FTE that Rochester Community Schools was paid on, you'll see that overall there were increases with the exception of 2 years, the 14-15 school year and the 2021 school year.
Matt, and that's the audited number, right?
That is, yes, the DS 4120 is an audited number.
What was the situation with 14-15?
I think that was before Matt's time and Dana's time. That was a year that we had a hiccup in enrollment. And quite honestly, we were using a different demographer at that point.
Right,
and
okay.
I think that's why we're using a different demographer.
Yep, okay. We need to stop for a second for the audio. Oh, okay.
All right, so next we have enrollment data. This is by student. This is not FTE. This is from My School Data. So this is, information that's available on that website. And you can see that we pulled the information for all of Oakland County, as well as provided a total for Oakland County. So when you look at Oakland County, you'll see a reduction of about 7,500 students from the 1920 enrollment, which is pre-pandemic, to the 2021 enrollment during the pandemic. Overall, a change of about 4.41%. You look at Rochester Community Schools, you will see a decrease as well, but at 2.35% of 1920 enrollment. And as you can see, there's other school districts. There's every other Oakland County school district on that sheet. So you can see the results of all the rest of the county. It's all in the red on this sheet, right? That everybody lost students. And this information.
One question to clarify, just sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
So the difference between the enrollment data on the previous sheet and on this sheet is one of those is audited numbers and one is not?
The FTE number versus.
The FTE, okay,
Yep.
thank you.
So
Matt,
this
can you
is-
just talk a little bit about FTEs versus students and what that means and how that works? And then maybe add in a little bit about the other categoricals that sometimes plug into that number.
Sure. So, when we're talking FTE, that's a full-time equivalency. So it could be a student, for example, when we provide services to a private school, we get a portion of that student. So if we're teaching a gym class, maybe we'll get a 0.05 FTE. Now, when we look at the enrollment data, that would count that as a student, right? A student is a student. Doesn't matter if I'm, just there part-time. It doesn't matter if I'm a special education student, right? So we have our general ed FTE, and then we have a special ed FTE. So you may get different funding for those special education students, but they're not a full-time FTE. They only need a partial part of their day with special education services. And then there's other programs that impact this, like our ECSE, our Birth to 3 program. We don't typically get a full FTE. And there's also situations, and Melanie Streitler, our supervisor of student enrollment, is here and could explain this a little bit better than I could. But early middle college, you can also get more than one FTE, right? So that's right, Melanie, right? Early middle college? Yes, early middle college is the item where you can receive more than one FTE for a student. All right, so if we move on to the next page, then this is where we're looking at FTE. This is what we get paid on. That other slide that we just showed was, again, students, not FTE. So this is a little bit hard to see as well, but again, we wanted to provide the data for the full county. You'll see that this is the 1920 count, which traditionally has been the prior spring count and the current fall count. So for the 1920 school year, this was the spring 19 count, which really occurred during the 1819 school year, and the fall 19 count, and then the spring 20 count and the fall 20 count. Again, very similar to what we mentioned before, Oakland County as a whole saw a reduction in membership blend when you compare that same method of about 4.23%. When you look at Rochester Community Schools, that was 2.45%, or a reduction of about 377 FTE. One of the changes that the legislature made for us this year was to allow for the super blend. So the super blend is 75% of that 1920 number, that 1920 count, and 25% of what your current count under the traditional rules would have been. So when we look at what the super blend allowed the school to do, was that we were able to capture 283 more FTE under that calculation than we would under the traditional calculation. Or we benefited by about 1.88% of 1920 membership.
Hey, Matt.
Yes, sir.
So that's just for this year. Is that something that you're not expecting them to do again?
So that was language that was in the return to learn law that was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor last August. And that's what we're waiting to find out moving forward. If nothing changes, it will be 90-10. And Matt will explain that.
Yep. So currently in the three proposals that we'll look at, it is the traditional 90-10, fall of the current school year and spring of the previous school year. But we don't have a state budget yet. So there's always chances that could change, and anything that's in the budget could change.
And there's a possibility that we would get 90-10 with a budget. And then at some other point in time, the legislature would pass what they call a supplemental bill, and then it could possibly change. So we'll keep a close eye on that. Matt alluded to it, but there's three options. There's 90-10, there's the super blend, and then quite honestly, I made a strong case for the best year of the last three based on the October audited number. And no, it wouldn't be an average. It would be the best year of the last three rolling based on the October number. So there would be no blend between October and spring. It would only be the October number, or other superintendents would say, or which is higher. Yeah.
So 90-10 is the red number up there, and the super blend is green, right? So 90-10 is bad.
Yeah, when we look at this data here, 90-10 is what traditionally we would have been paid on this year. So what that reduction would have been. However, the super blend allowed us to be paid on additional FTE because they changed the calculation from the traditional 90-10 fall, spring count.
Thanks.
All right, so next we're going to take a look at, for Rochester, what changed by graduating class. Go ahead, Laura, you can change it to the next slide. So one piece to note here is that this is audited data straight from the DS 4120. However, when we want to compare this across Oakland County, the state does not differentiate between transitional kindergarten and kindergarten. So kindergarten is all lumped as one number. So please take note of that when you look at the class of 2033 and the class of 2032. So there's a few pieces to point out when we look at this data. You'll see that our graduating class of 2020 was over 1,200 FTE, and our incoming class, kindergarten class, was 1,009. So when we did this comparison, we looked at the spring of 2020. This count was actually completed before the pandemic began in Michigan. And this is the fall number of the pandemic. So you'll see a smaller incoming class, though as we looked at earlier in the presentation, we know that birth rates are declining and the overall population seems to be declining as well. We also looked at elementary students during the spring of 2020, and you'll see that that is where we had the loss this year. We lost 216.3 FTE in elementary students when we look at spring of 2020 to fall of 2020. And then when we look at secondary students, we'll see it was a reduction, but again, it was only 2.35 FTE, so a very small amount. So the bulk of our loss in FTE was in elementary, and then a smaller incoming class, which was not a surprise as birth rates and population has decreased. So just to dive a little bit deeper into enrollment, we'll take a look at what happened in some other data that we saw. So moving on to the next slide, what other items here caused a reduction in students when we look back to the pre-pandemic numbers? So we saw additional students enrolled in private school than in the previous year. We also saw that more students were homeschooled. However, fewer students moved out of district. As we talked about earlier, there are fewer students that enrolled in kindergarten. And there are fewer secondary student drops than in previous year, which supports that idea that, we only lost 2.35 FTE when we look at secondary. So now as we look towards the 21-22 year, what we see so far, and it's not the same timeline, and again, remember that we were in a much different place during the pandemic last year at the same time than we are now, but we received 150 more online registrations compared to the same time frame last year. You'll remember last year was the first time we ever had an online registration system. So timing was fortunate for us that we were able to do that. Otherwise, we'd be back to the paper enrollments and having to manually process that. So we have some data to compare to, and there's 150 more online, and that's something that we're going to track through until the start of next school year. We have data on those rates for May, June, July, and August. What last year showed was that June saw a decline from May. And then as we started thinking about the school year for next year, July enrollments or registrations, grew from that June number. And then August was larger than that July number. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not that trend holds for next school year.
And is that for kindergarten?
That's overall for the district. Okay. I mean, the majority of that is transitional kindergarten and kindergarten students. That's where we see our greatest enrollment changes, but that's throughout K-12 or TK-12. Also, in looking at registrations that we have so far, we started tracking students that are re-enrolling in Rochester Community Schools that were in either a private school or homeschool or another public school, but had at one time been enrolled in Rochester schools. So what we've saw there so far is that 62 students have re-enrolled from a private school. 10 students have re-enrolled from a home school, and 8 students have re-enrolled from another public school. Overall, that's 80 re-enrollments, with 62 of them being at elementary. All right, so after talking a little bit about enrollment, we're going to talk about foundation allowance, right? Because when we combine the two numbers, that's how we get the majority of our funding. But before we move on, are there any other questions about enrollment?
I don't know if this is where it falls or if it falls later, but do we have any information on virtual versus, in-person regular school and what the division will look like there?
Sure. So there was, I believe, a survey put out to families to see if they would prefer the virtual campus next year. I believe, and I don't have the most updated number, but I believe that's about 450 students that have committed to returning to the virtual campus. Now that could change, and it may change. Families may make a different decision by the time school starts in August, but at this point, there's 450 commitments to the virtual campus.
And we're still using Decision Insight, right? Correct? For projection, for enrollment projections. I know they've changed names. I forgot what their name is now.
Who knew it?
Who knew it? Okay. So they're still doing the same sort of capturing housing starts and birth rates in their formula where they try to accurately predict
Correct. So,
enrollment.
yeah, when we look at their data for 1920, of course, that was pre-pandemic. That was very, very close. We actually were 5 students short of that projection. However, they made their projection for 2021 before the pandemic began. So that reduction was about 444 students, I believe, off. But again, the original projection was made before the pandemic began, and the actual number is based on the pandemic. So they do forecast an increase in students, about 15,059 students, which is an increase based or compared to the 2021 number. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with that projection and how accurate it is. I think with the global pandemic, it makes projecting something that's already somewhat tough, but they have a methodology and look at housing startups and different items to help project that number. But I'm not sure what the pandemic will do to that projection.
So most demographers will tell you that they can get you into with 1% plus or minus. We've had pretty good luck with Decision Insight, but we're always looking for opportunities to look at the data differently because of that 1%. Because if it's 1% to the bad, it's a lot of money. So it's something that we're constantly looking at with our student demographics and how we collect data from our parents, so we know who's coming, who's going, and where they came from or went to. And it's critically important. We'll continue, just for the board's digestion, we'll continue to sparse that up and try to get better and better at enrollment projections. But I've been doing this a little while now, and I have not met a demographer yet that'll will warranty their work more than 1%.
And just one other question. I think I asked you this when I saw the budget for the first time, but those like the TK kindergarten numbers, when we see that decrease in first grade, it's because kindergarten and TK are one thing for the state, but it's a 2-year commitment. So they don't go into first grade the next year like they normally would.
Correct.
when
That's a great piece to point out, that when you look at that, the class of 2032 and 2033, some of those students were never anticipated to get to first grade from kindergarten, right? They were TK students that would move to kindergarten. That'd be the next progression for them. So that number would stay in that rather than move on. So you will see a reduction when you look at class of 2032 of about, I think it was 109, if I remember right. Not all of that is unexpected because of the TK students that were counted in that group, but would not have moved on to first grade. They would move on to kindergarten.
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure I was remembering that right. Thank you.
Hey, Matt, any theory or thought behind I looked at the numbers there and things that popped out to me was Rochester, Clarkston, and Troy saw pretty substantially less loss than a lot of other people. I was wondering what kind of talk in your spaces out there with folks that you work with, your peer group. Is there anything out there that kind of suggests why those numbers are where they are for those 3 districts, including our own?
Well, that's a great question. I know that at least on the finance side, right, that we're all pretty thankful for the super blend that allowed us to be paid on more FT than we otherwise would have. You know, I don't know that there's been more talk other than I would say take a look at the numbers and look at our competitors and what's happened in Oakland County and what happened here at Rochester. I think that tells the story, but be happy if Dr. Shane or Dana or
And well, I would say this, the more stable your enrollment, the better you did with the super blend. So if you look at the school districts that have stable enrollment, they did better with the super blend number. Just for point of clarification, Rochester, if you think about this is something you've got to bear in mind. Rochester, I think we're one of 2 school districts in Oakland County that are not open to any kind of choice from outside the district. So I think that number is significant in terms of being able to, for lack of a better way to describe it in financial terms, beating the street. Because many school districts will market into another district and market into multiple districts, and we're able to maintain our enrollment even that practice. I feel like I have to do a check 1 2 now. Let's give him a second here. Are we losing sound? Is that what's going on, or is it just scratchy? Yeah. All right. Well. Yeah. That's fine. Go ahead. Let me work it out. Just have to. Is this working?
All right, thank you.
Thank you, sir. I know that can't be easy. We appreciate your hard work. So we were talking about super blends, stable school districts, and how that works.
Yeah, and I
All
think
right,
it's a great point that you make that Rochester is not a school of choice district, right? So we can only capture the enrollment in our boundaries. And there's other school districts, when we look at that data, that are school of choice that can capture students from outside their own boundaries, excuse me.
And you think of school district that maybe has a large virtual academy for a very long time. That's part of their marketing strategy, is to capture people in other school districts. Nothing wrong with it. It's legal. It's just what happens in the market these days.
All right, so continuing on with the presentation, let's talk a little bit about what foundational allowance is. We've talked a lot about enrollment, but foundational allowance is a per pupil funding amount that pays the bulk of school operations and was created as part of Proposal A, school finance reforms in 94-95. In those initial 94-95 levels, the minimum level of funding was $4,200. And the state guaranteed maximum was $6,500. So next, we'll take a look at what that has meant for Rochester Community Schools. So again, the foundational allowance is set by the state of Michigan, the state legislature, and the governor, and is really dependent on the state's overall economic condition. So as you look at there, we mentioned it earlier that in 2010-11, the per pupil foundational allowance was $8,348. In 11-12, that was reduced to $7,878. and would stay there for an additional year, but would slowly grow. The current foundational allowance is $8,529, or about $2,000 more than the maximum in 1994-95. To note, the 1011 foundation does not include a Section 11D reduction of $170 per pupil. That was actually enacted in 1112 as part of that $300 per pupil rollback. So the 170 was part of 1011, and then 1112 was 300, but in total a $470 reduction. The current proposals that we'll look at also reduce one-time Section 11D money that was $65 per pupil.
Sorry. It's not me. Thank you again, sir.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, the 21-22 current proposals that are in the governor's budget, the House and Senate budget also reduce the one-time $65 per pupil Section 11D money and looking at next year. So as we look at foundational allowance across Oakland County and across the state, you'll see that there's a minimum foundational allowance, really that creates a floor, right? That's the lowest per pupil foundation. And there's the state maximum, which really should be a ceiling, but is a ceiling above which the state would not contribute. So there are hold harmless districts out there that received additional foundation using local revenue.
Dana, can you just explain when that changed and how that's not a choice. Districts can't, that was when they did the shift, correct?
Correct.
Could you just, if you don't mind, Dana, just kind of give a history lesson on that? Because I think sometimes it's lost on people. Like how can Birmingham get $12,200 per kid and we get $8,500?
Sure. So the intent of proposal A was to more equalize state funding because you had very affluent neighborhoods or districts that collected a lot of money in property tax. And then you had districts that didn't have a good tax base that weren't able to collect very much because the millage that everybody collected had to be approved by the community. And so when proposal A came in, they said, okay, we're going to set a minimum that everybody gets. And we're going to set, a maximum that we're going to pay. But there were districts at the time that were collecting a lot of money in property tax. And so those are the districts that are called hold harmless districts. Say that best 3 times. And so they can collect that from their community.
So it'd be like, right, like Warren had the tech center and they were getting an enormous amount of money per child based on the property taxes in Warren at the time. So there was a deal with the legislature to kind of allow them to get more than the foundation allowance, but burn down from what they were collecting. Fermi too, Monroe was like that, and so on and so forth. I can't tell you in terms of what was going on in Birmingham at the time. I remember I was a kid, there was a tractor plant there at 15 in Coolidge. That might have been it. But most of these districts had some type of influx of ability to collect property tax that when they shifted to the minimum foundation grant, it was going to cut their funding less than in half. So there was a deal in order to get proposal A through the legislature to protect these school districts they're getting these large amounts of per pupil funding.
Yeah, if you have a lot of taxable value, you can maybe it's a little easier to approve a smaller, millage, and you still get lots of money.
Right, so as you mentioned, Dr. Shaner, there's district that receive up to $12,364 per pupil. That's actually the current maximum in the state. Rochester receives $8,529 per pupil, which is currently the state maximum, though the hold harmless districts, as we mentioned, exceed that. And then the state minimum foundation, there are some districts in Oakland County that receive the minimum, which is $8,111. And the state has worked to increase that or to decrease that gap. And as I pointed out earlier, we've saw about a $2,000 increase from 94.95 in our foundational allowance numbers. However, those at the bottom have received about a $4,000 increase. Right, you'll remember those numbers were 4,200 minimum and 6,500 maximum. The current minimum is 8,111, and the current maximum is $8,529. So where does all this money that's used for the foundational allowance come from to support the school aid fund and support sending districts that foundational allowance? Well, this is from the state budget office from fiscal year 2019. In 2019, there was about 15.3 billion in the school aid fund. And the majority of that was made up of three different items. Sales and use tax made up about 43%. Income tax was almost 19%, and property tax was 14%. There are some other items in here, like federal revenue or the state lottery, but the state lottery made up 7% of overall school aid funding.
Matt, I had heard something in a news report regarding the lottery funds, because everybody is like, what about all the lottery money? Why aren't, schools getting all the money they need from the lottery funds? And I had heard that the funds from lottery basically cover 3 weeks, or what I think it was 3 weeks of expenditures for all school districts throughout the state of Michigan. So, when you look at how many districts there are in Michigan, how many schools, it's not a huge percentage that, school districts are getting back from the quote unquote, lottery fund monies.
Correct. Yeah. In 19, it was only 7% of the total 15.3 billion. All right. So we've talked about state funding. Let's move on and talk a little bit about ESSER funding. And ESSER funds are allocated using the Title I Part A funding formula. There's a section of that funding formula, Section 1120A, that requires that funds are allocated to private non-public schools. That is a federal regulation. So when we look at total ESSER funding, and I want to point out that not all of this funding has been allocated. The state has allocated ESSER 1 funding, 43.6% of ESSER 2 funding, and none of ESSER 3 funding at this time. But this is the total estimated allocations, assuming ESSER 3 and the difference in ESSER 2 that hasn't been allocated.
Matt, could you just repeat that one more time? I just want that to sink in, because that's really important, because that's what the legislature is really negotiating over right now, is the release of those ESSER funds. And we don't know when that's going to happen.
Yep. So ESSER 2 has currently been allocated at 43.6% of its total. There's still almost 57% that remains to be allocated by the state legislature, and none of ESSER 3 has been allocated to this point. When we look at the total, right? So assuming, I'm sorry, Mike.
So the ESSER funds come from the federal government, they go to the state, and then the state decides how to distribute them among the school districts? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, the state has some say over it, but ESSER is elementary and secondary school emergency relief. So it's part of the overall COVID relief package. But there's certain amounts that are specifically designated. I believe it's 90% of ESSER money is specifically designated for school districts.
So you said what percentage of it hasn't been allocated?
So when we look at ESSER 2, 43.6% has been allocated. The governor line item vetoed the difference, and then ESSER 3 has not been allocated at all.
So what's holding that up?
Well,
boy, I could stand here and air my frustration about that all night, Mike. There's extensive negotiations going on in the legislature. If I'm being direct, I don't think the executive branch has taken a direct role in that yet. I think as the funds move out of the House and into the Senate, I expect that to happen. I don't expect that to happen quickly though, and I think there's a ton of different things federally as well as from the state that will drive that. It's a point of frustration for I know every organization I can talk about, because as we talk about foundation grants staying stagnant, needing pupil accounting relief for declining enrollment across the state, and it bears noting, declining enrollment has been a problem in Michigan schools for a very long time. It is a function of the birth rate. And I'm not talking about people choosing to leave public school and go to private school. I'm talking about the overall population of school age children. They're just not as many. People are having fewer kids. But this is what we talk about when we talk about the lack of a systemic funding model for schools in Michigan. And that's why the School Finance Research Collaborative exists. But that is outside of these one-time funds. So if anyone thought the school budget was complicated, it just got more complicated because we're trying to figure out when these ESSER funds will be released. And then Matt will talk about again that there's regulations on when the money has to be spent by. And that is immaterial to when the state allocates the money.
So a follow-up question to that then would be, if the state doesn't allocate the funding, the federal government has a deadline. Is it a use it or lose it situation? So if the state does not allocate the federal dollars, then the state loses out on those federal dollars? Do you know offhand?
I don't know off the top of my head. I believe there though is a penalty for not allocating within, I think ESSER 3 was 60 days once the state receives the funds.
But you told me that the state isn't deciding how to allocate it. Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's dollars designated for local school districts, but I think in the manner of which they allocate it to districts and the requirements, they have some say in that. I can't remember exactly what piece the governor vetoed. Maybe Dr. Shaner has more information on that line item, but the proposal that went to the governor to sign had fully allocated ESSER 2, but there was a line item veto. Correct. Yes, it was tie-barred to her. Yep.
So it's just being held hostage for other purposes, you know? Because I'm just thinking about the value of money, right? I mean, you want
No, for sure.
the dollar today versus the dollar tomorrow.
Absolutely. And again, the level of the poker playing at the legislative level and the executive level of who's going to blink first and allocate the money, while we're waiting here to make sure we serve the children with the money, is extremely problematic. And if you think of a district like Detroit, for instance, that got over $1 billion, or is earmarked to get over $1 billion, much of that money will be used on capital projects in Detroit that they can't bond for, like HVAC systems. And when you think about the cost of labor right now, the bidding requirements for all that stuff, because it's all got to be bid, right? It's all got to be designed. It's all got to be bid. And the materials aren't available, and then it's got to be spent by a certain amount of time. Fortunately or unfortunately, the amount of money that we would get won't amount to doing projects like that. It'll allow us to operate in a flat foundation grant arena. But I can't express to you how frustrating it is to watch this go on and watch it move at a snail's pace when it's time bound. The money's time bound, and as you can watch the economy as labor gets more expensive, material gets more expensive, and then it's complicated by a bidding process that has to be out there. It's necessary, but it does slow work down in a public setting. So it's a real challenge.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, Matt.
Thank you, Mike. So if we go back to the slide on the ESSER funding, we take a look at what ESSER is across Oakland County. Again, these are allocated using the Title I Part A funding formula, which is really based on poverty, and we've reviewed that at other work sessions. For Rochester, the anticipated allocation is a total of almost $3.6 million. You'll see on this chart that Rochester is the largest district in Oakland County, 15,000 students, and our allocation is 3.6 million. There's other allocations throughout Oakland County, and the largest being $61.5 million for Pontiac, who has a population of under 4,000 students.
But they also have a very high Title I population.
Correct. That's yeah. Based on that allocation is why they're receiving a total of 61 million. Same reason that Detroit, as Dr. Shaner mentioned, is receiving $1.25 billion. All right, as we look at the next slide, and this was a question earlier, and looks like I was off the year. ESSER 1 is 21, ESSER 2 is 22, and ESSER 3 is 23. However, there is a federal provision, the Tidings Amendment, that extends federal grants by 12 months beyond the fiscal year in which they are awarded. So we get an additional year. So ESSER 1 is really 2022 when you take into account the Tidings Amendment. ESSER 2 is 23, and ESSER 3 is 24.
So you were technically right.
Yeah, with the Tidings Amendment, yeah.
Yeah. Do you like wake up, sleeping, just think of, do you like sleep with numbers? And I mean, you have.
Honestly, the last 10 days, yes. This
Okay.
presentation has been, yes.
Matt, will you be covering what requirements, if any, are there on what this has to be spent on? Or is it purely up to the district to determine the best use of these funds?
I won't be getting into specifics, but yeah, we can have a discussion on that. The next slide is actually how the budget process works. So the district submits a plan for spending. We need to include a description, amounts, and the accounting information for how we're going to spend the money. There is, if I remember right, about 20 different allowable costs. There is not a supplant provision like there is with Title I Part A.
So Matt, you just explain that real quick, what supplanting is, because that's a red flag in federal grant world. Can you just explain that? And then we go back and just, again, the non-public part of it. So it's our responsibility by regulation to allocate funds to private schools, right?
Correct. Yep. So supplement versus supplant, the district, when we're looking at Title I funds, is expected to provide a certain level of service to all of our students. We cannot use Title I funds in a Title I building to take the same teacher that should have been provided and say, all right, Mr. Muska, you were general fund last year. We have Title I at your building now. We're going to pay you out of Title I without at least providing an additional teacher in that same position. So doing that would supplant, right? We're not supposed to reduce general fund money with federal support. We're supposed to supplement that program with additional resources, which could be a staff member, it could be supplies or other items. And again, I don't know how many times I can say this, but yeah, to Dr. Shaner's point, we're legally required to allocate funds to private and non-public schools. That's why if you see ESSER 1 funding, we have items for St. John, for Holy Family, and I believe Eagle Creek Academy, because they're entitled to it and they wanted to receive it, and we had to, right? We would have been in violation if we did not allocate that money and spend that money for those private non-public schools. So as part of the budget process, right, we have our line items or our spending plan. We put in the description, say we're going to spend it on a virtual teacher, for example. MDE will receive the plan and they can approve any piece of that plan, or they can send it back for modifications. So it could be, they may just need additional information. So for example, with Title I, we have to provide highly qualified staff, and sometimes they even ask for the name of that staff member. So if we said, Title I teacher, in the spending plan, they might send it back and say, I need the last name and I need another highly qualified. So we would submit, all right, Mr. Muska, highly qualified teacher, Title I, and then we would be able to, they would be able to approve that part of the plan. Other times, it's possible that they may say that this is not an allowable cost. And there are many allowable costs when it comes to ESSER money, including upgrades to HVAC, cleaning, items like that. We've, as a district, upgraded HVAC units at many of our buildings through the bond fund. We're conducting a air balance survey at all of our buildings, and we've applied for funding from FEMA, which you'll see later on, to help support the costs of cleaning and the necessary equipment to clean our buildings. So with this ESSER budget process, it'll be a back and forth between the district and MDE, right? Once we give them enough information, they believe it's allowable, then they can approve it. And once it's approved, then the district can begin to spend the money. If there's additional questions, then they'll continue to send back modifications until they're able to approve it. Now, depending on what you're purchasing or the dollar amount of what you're purchasing, they may require a higher level. So as this slide shows, the field consultant will provide the initial review. Certain dollar amounts or certain categories of items in the past have required an additional approval from a manager. So for example, when we look or think about Title I, Part A, MDE defines capital outlay as any item above $5,000. And if you submit a capital outlay item to the Michigan Department of Education, a field consultant will need to review it, and then it will also need to go to management for an additional review before we can get our either approval or the additional modifications. So there is a hierarchy of approvals depending on the dollar amount and what items are being purchased. All right, so again, there's a lot of data on this slide. This is one-time COVID-19 related funding. It is not all ESSER funding. There's several other sources, and I'll go through this. There's Section 11P coronavirus relief funds. That was $5.4 million. That was the money that we talked about earlier when the state reduced state funding by $175 per pupil. They replaced it with $350 per pupil of federal funding, and that is the 5.4 million here. There's also a Section 103.2 district COVID costs. There's 190,000 that also came in August with that $5.4 million payment. Here is ESSER 1, 252,916 was the total award to the district. But again, we are legally required to provide an allocation to private non-public schools based on the allocation formula. So not all of that money went to Rochester Community Schools. ESSER 2, that's the 43.6% that's been allocated. Oakland Together School Support Funds, this was almost 1.8 million that we used on Chromebooks. The Oakland Response Fund, which was a number of items, including pre-K, cleaning, and professional development. And then additional funding for the Michigan Association of Intermediate School Administrators for the MyConnect device purchasing program is about 188,000. And then Caring Steps has received some Michigan Child Care Relief grants totaling about $96,000. Total that's been allocated is almost $8.5 million in one-time COVID-19 relief funding. Also on this slide is anticipated COVID-19 relief funding. There's the other portion of ESSER 2. There's all of ESSER 3. There's $1 million from FEMA that I mentioned earlier. And there's the $450 per pupil equalization amount, about almost 5.9 million based on our ESSER 2 allocation.
And Matt, that's the money that's tied to hours of instruction, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's the requirement that you have to meet in person or offer in-person instruction for 20 hours per week, starting March 22nd.
Matt, so how much of the part that's been allocated has all of that been spent already, or is some of that still waiting to be used?
The part that ESSER two, none of that has been spent yet. We've submitted our spending plan. However, there is a formal approval process that'll occur, much like we mentioned a little bit ago, where Mr. Heiss submitted our idea of what we're going to spend, kind of like we did with the food service fund, right? Here's what we think we're going to spend it on. Now, once you're actually going to allocate it, you need to specifically say that line item description, the accounting for it, the amount. We still have yet to do that. And once that is done, then we can start, once that's approved, then we can start drawing down those funds.
And that's through MDE provides that approval, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Now, that will happen very similar to ESSER one, which was essentially modeled after the Title I Part A process through MEGS Plus.
Do those items, like the items that are at, or that you're getting ready for ESSER two to submit to the MDE, after that's been approved and you get the quotes for the items, does that still come through the board, or how is that processed?
Yeah, it would depend on the total dollar amount. We've purchased Title I items or Title III items in the past that don't reach the level that would need board approval. We bought dictionaries for Title III that, are $15, $20 a book, and maybe we need 20 of them. So, depending on the level would determine whether or not, and the dollar amount would determine whether or not that would come to the board for formal approval.
What is the source of the Oakland Response Fund? Like, where does that originate from? From the ISD or?
Those Oakland response grants were actually provided through the United Way. They're the ones that manage those funds, and they provided some funding for pre-K, as well as I think it was almost 100,000 for cleaning and for PD.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
How many of these did we apply for and how many were just a part of automatic public school funding?
Yeah, there's an application for ESSER 1, 2, and 3, though we didn't necessarily apply for those. So the ones where we had to reach out and submit a request to try to get funding would be the Oakland Response Fund, the MyConnect device purchasing, the Michigan Child Care Relief Grants, and FEMA. It looks like there's a formula error. So the anticipated COVID relief funding is not 3.3 million. You need to add in that 5.9 million to get the total for that anticipated money. And again, there's some notes on that slide mentioning whether or not those are fully allocated.
And Matt, I just want to jump in real quickly on the equalization money, just so people don't believe that it's a foregone conclusion. We have no idea if we're going to get that equalization and what amount we're making an educated guess on it, correct?
Correct. We're anticipating that we'll qualify based on the 20 hours of instruction per week because that was in place before March 22nd. However, any situation could change that before the end of the school year, and that funding could be reduced or completely eliminated based upon the language in the legislation. All right, so we've talked a lot about state funding and the federal funding related to one-time COVID-19 monies. Before we start talking about the next year's general fund budget, any other questions? I know there've been a lot of discussion here, but any other questions on those items before we move on? Okay. All right, so as we look to the 21-22 general fund budget, there's some overarching ideas when we consider this budget. We're going to maintain current enrollment levels based on our fall 2019, or excuse me, fall 2020 count, the audited numbers there. Because all the proposals currently have a reduction of Section 11D money, which was $65 per pupil. This budget also includes a reduction of $65 per pupil. The current proposals also feature the traditional membership blend, which was 90% of the current fall count and 10% of the previous spring. We're assuming that there's no additional one-time COVID-19 funding other than what we know. And there's actually a proposal that we'll talk about and Dr. Shainer's mentioned. And that we anticipate, and you'll see this throughout the budgets that we present, that we anticipate a return to closer to normal operations. We don't anticipate or assume with these budget assumptions that the year is going to be quite as affected by COVID-19 as the current year is. We're also going to align general fund expenditures to revenue. We're going to put in any contractual increases. As always, place an emphasis on maximizing operational efficiencies, prioritize highly effective student-focused programs and services, conduct cost-benefit analysis, and again, as we mentioned earlier, use fund balance responsibly.
Matt, just a quick question. I know you said you're using the assumption of decreasing the per pupil funding by $65, but I guess my question is, why are we going with that model? Because of the three, isn't one up 60, one's down 15, one's up 15, something like that?
Yes,
And-
we'll look at the three different scenarios for those proposals. But the only thing that's completely certain is all three proposals remove that $65. We don't know if the 82 from the governor or the 120 from the Senate or I think it's the 50 from the House is going to be enacted. So the current budget is just that $65 loss. And when we look at those proposals, we'll either add back in the $82 per pupil from the governor's proposal or the 120 from the Senate or the 50 from the House.
You're saying you'll add that in when?
When we look at the other scenarios.
Oh, okay.
We have all three scenarios for you and then 10, essentially 9 different scenarios to show you tonight. I don't think I've ever in the 10 years that I've sat in this chair, I don't think I've ever brought the board 10 different scenarios.
As we move on to the revenue assumptions, we already talked about most of those state revenue assumptions. An increase in facility rentals is in local revenue. As stated earlier, return to much closer to normal operations, meaning that we're going to rent our facilities both outdoor and indoor for more of the year than we did this year. An increase in tuition-based program revenue as well. That's our school age care, our pre-K, our enrichment programs, bases, items like that. An increase in other fees, which could be parking passes, pay to play, those other items. The state revenue will utilize any remaining one-time COVID-19 funding. Again, just to reiterate again, maintain current enrollment levels, a $65 per pupil reduction, and the traditional count. Though there is an increase in special education reimbursement, special education funding is based on actual costs. So we, in 1920, reduced costs and didn't have transportation costs for part of the year. So we've calculated what we believe the increase will be based on the budgeted amounts and included that in state revenue. There's also federal revenue that's one-time COVID-19 funding, and we'll utilize that if needed. And then in transfers in and other financing sources, we talked about the Oakland Together, the 1.8 million for Chromebooks. That came out of this budget, as well as any other utilized one-time COVID-19 funding. So on the next slide, we'll look at what that does to the dollar amounts. And again, this is a little bit hard to see, but you'll see that local revenue is up about 1.8 million, very close to the final actuals of 1920, which was 27 million, anticipating about 26.9 million in revenue. State revenue is up slightly, a reduction in federal revenue, which is a lot of that one-time COVID-19 funding, and the reduction in transfers in and other financing sources that Oakland Together that I mentioned earlier, about 185 million in general fund revenue. Next, we'll talk about operating expenditures and just expenditures in general as we look at the budget. As Christy and Kevin shared, the data that we submit to the financial information database generates two of these charts that we're going to show. One is operating expenditures. Here you'll see that roughly 60% of our budget is instructional expenditures, though this chart also lumps in function code 293, which is athletics, in with instruction. And then you'll see the other categories. Pupil support, for example, is almost 9% of the overall operating expenditures. There's some other information there, but those of you that have the hard copy, you might be able to read that a little bit better than on the screen. The next chart that we're going to look at is our personnel expenditures. So based on this information, you'll see that approximately 81% of our expenditures is for salary and benefits. You'll see about 50% is salary, and the remaining 31% is employee insurance benefits, FICA and retirement, non-employment, and other expenditures. And then there's also a breakdown of the other remaining items like professional and technical purchase services and capital outlay. But again, 81% of our budget is people.
Excuse me, how would you say this compares to equivalent districts in Oakland County in terms of 80% of our budget is, goes towards salaries for instruction?
Yeah, I would say in general, the majority of school districts, 78 to 80%, or maybe even a little bit higher is where you'd find salaries and benefits. Though there is that bulletin, I don't know if it's 1014 or which one it is, that shows you information for all schools in Michigan. So I'd reference that presentation that Christy and Kevin put on, and you can look at some of that information there as well. All right, so knowing that 81% of our expenditure budget is personnel and salaries and benefits, let's look at our expenditure assumptions for the 21-22 budget. And just like we did with revenue, we're going to remove any one-time COVID-19 funding. We're going to project any known increases. For example, we have contracts in place. We know the retirement rate's going to increase. And then we're restoring expenditures that did not occur in the 2021 budget that we removed due to COVID-19. As we mentioned earlier, field trips and the related transportation costs, and then restoring tuition-based programming, school-age care, pre-K, enrichment, basis to more normal levels than what was experienced in 2021. So let's take a quick look at the numbers. And again, I know this is hard to read, but you'll see some large reductions. I want to point out that those are the one-time COVID-19 relief funding amounts. There's 3.4 million for instructional staff support, a reduction there. That's Chromebooks at 1.8 million. That's virtual campus creation costs at about $1 million. There's also a decrease of 1.2 million in operations, maintenance, and security. And that's, again, cleaning and associated cleaning supplies, equipment, masks, things like that were required for the pandemic. Overall expenditures are $186.7 million. Looking at the next slide, we'll see what happens to fund balance. So fund balance of about revenue of about 185 million on expenditures of 186.7 million. Again, about a $1.8 million use of fund balance. I'm assuming, again, those larger items maintain current enrollment levels, $65 per pupil cut, and the traditional current fall, prior spring count.
Matt, before you go on, just a quick question. Because this is such high level, right? Are there any changes that we're looking to make next year, whether it's a new program where we need to add people or fewer people, or, we're going to be updating our media centers and providing funding there, or anything like that, we're not seeing at this high level?
Sure. I mean, some of the larger assumptions aren't in there. We mentioned them earlier that we'll align our expenditures to our enrollment as best we can. Though we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, it really depends on the number of students and the makeup of those students for the larger salary and benefit amounts. I will say, looking at programming, we know that the orchestra programming is moving to the high school next year, and we will need to pay for instruments and that was actually board approved last time. So those items will need to be paid for out of this budget and are anticipated.
I just want to remind everyone also, it's hard to even think about, but a year ago, February, we had embarked on our strategic planning process. As we go into the new school year, we've teased that with the community a little bit, that we're going to start that again. And we will start that as a large community initiative early in the fall, because it's going to be very important to chart our path forward and to forecast that out for the next 5 years. So there's a lot of work to be done yet. It does feel good to start talking about normalcy and about doing things like bringing the community together and get down to doing the strategic planning process with a large committee like we've done in the past, and it's been very, very useful. So a lot of things to be done and a lot more ball to be played, so to speak, in terms of keeping an eye on the legislature and see what actually gets allocated.
All right, so speaking of the legislature, next we're going to take a look at the proposals that are currently on the table. Just as a reminder.
And Matt, I just want to say again, just very quickly, you know, we're talking about these numbers kind of a little bit in absolutes. This could all become birdcage fodder by 5 o'clock tomorrow, depending on what the legislature chooses to do. Or we could take it to the bank. I don't know what's going to turn out to be. We could come back to the board at another time and give you 9 more scenarios based on things that change in the legislature and the allocation of funds. I just want to have people bear that in mind.
Yep. So as Dr. Shaner mentioned, this is what's currently on the table right now. As you can see, we are at the maximum foundation allowance. So most of these proposals increase foundation at the 2x amount. So what that means for Rochester Community Schools is that we would get the smallest amount of increase because we're already at the maximum, and those at the minimum would see the larger increase. So the governor's proposal currently is an $82 increase for Rochester schools, though taken with a $65 per pupil repeal of Section 11D, that's really a $17 per pupil increase. When we look at the Senate proposal, that is a $60 per pupil increase with a $65 cut, but $125 increase. And the House proposal is actually a reduction in overall funding based on us receiving $50, but receiving a $65 cut as well. So a negative $15 per pupil decrease. When we look next at how those play out with the numbers, I want to point out that the way this is shown is to also calculate what the net increase is. So you'll see the governor's proposal is $17, but you'll see a large $1.228 million increase. That's because we've already removed the $65. So we are really truly adding the $82 increase, though it kind of looks a little misleading. But assuming that $82 increase with the governor's proposal, or the net $17 increase, that is a use of fund balance of about $600,000. The Senate proposal, which is the $125 per pupil increase, but $65 reduction, net $60 per pupil, is about a break-even budget. Here it's $32,000 addition to fund balance. And then the House proposal, which is a $50 per pupil increase, but $65 cut, net $15 loss, is about a $1.1 million use of fund balance. And as Dr. Shaner mentioned, all of these proposals could change, by 5 o'clock tomorrow, and they could change multiple times before we get an actual state budget. We talk about it later in the presentation, but I want to remind everyone that we didn't have a state budget until September 30th last year. So we were 3 months into our fiscal year before we knew the foundational allowance.
Matt, I have a question. I've heard discussion that the state legislature wants to evaluate the state budget on a quarterly basis. How would that impact school districts in their budgeting? Or would it?
I guess it depends on how they structured that, right? If they're gonna introduce supplementals on a quarterly basis, that's gonna make funding and budgeting for a school district more challenging.
Yeah.
And more, maybe more risky as a poor review from the May consensus revenue estimating conference, and there's also a conference in January, could negatively impact the budget. You'll remember last year that the May consensus revenue estimating conference, based on the pandemic, estimated a huge shortfall.
Yep.
But because of the COVID-19 relief funding, that shortfall was not nearly as bad as they initially estimated, right?
Right.
The economy
Right.
and the funding did what it was supposed to do, which was support the economy. And while there was still a reduction, the increase or the decreases, excuse me, that they projected were not as bad when the next consensus conference came around, which was
Right.
in August.
Right. But I also heard too that that was just prolonging the inevitable down the road in terms of a shortfall. too.
Sure. I mean, that's one of our concerns. We talked about it with ARA, and Dana mentioned it with the fiscal cliff, that, one-time federal money is one-time federal money, and that money is going to run out.
Right.
And I'm not sure if there's going to be an ESSER 4 or any other additional COVID relief funding. What we do know is that the current proposals from the governor, the House, and the Senate, two of the three mean a use of fund balance based on our assumptions right now, and one is a break-even budget, which, we don't know where those proposals are going to be by the time they're actually signed into law, but not necessarily a positive sign at this point.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm confused. So the section 11, $65 was a decrease or an increase to the pupil?
So for the current school year, it was an increase of $65 per pupil. But they put it in section 11D rather than in with the foundation allowance. So when they reduce it or repeal it this year, it is a reduction, but at the same time, it's not a reduction to foundation allowance. So I can say that I'm increasing foundation allowance even though I'm cutting per pupil revenue for the district, if that makes sense. Right, it's just in a different bucket.
Yeah, okay. Oh, I see. Okay, it's not part of the per pupil allowance. That's
Correct. It's not foundation allowance, but yet it's funded in a very similar manner to the foundation allowance per pupil. But because it's not foundation allowance, I can cut it and still say there's an increase. All right, so there's the scenarios, right? Our proposed budget based on our assumptions. And then the three assumptions from the governor, the Senate, and the House. Again, those could change at any minute. Next, we'll look at the count and per pupil membership and how this has historically been calculated. Now you'll see that this goes back to 94, 95, and there's been a variety. There's actually been 8 different methods that have been used to calculate the foundation allowance. But last year was the super blend that we spoke about. And then before that, there was a 90-10, 90 of the current fall and 10 of this prior spring, which was in place for 4 or 5 years before they changed it to a current year. So at one time it was current year fall and current year spring. But the legislature determines how pupil membership is calculated, and we saw that through since 1994, 95, they've made 8 different changes, and it's possible that they'll change it again. And on there is a recommendation from the Return to School Advisory Council to use the highest of the last 3 years. So we take a look at what that does to funding. You'll see on the next slide that.
Matt, I had a question about this.
Sure.
Just the history of the calculation for the blend and how it, as far back as 94, it was 50-50, then it was 60-40, then it was 80-20, 90-10. So can you speak to the rationale, if there is one, in terms of why they change it so much? And what's the benefit of changing it and not going with the 50-50 split, say?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can speak to the legislature's thinking throughout. I think, when I started in school finance, so was it 8 years ago? The thought at the time was that current year, right? So it was the spring count of the current year rather than the previous spring. And I think the thought there was that as students moved from one school to another, that they were trying to capture that change. But then they switched it back to what was done previously and added Section 25E, which allowed you to do something similar, right? So Section 25E allows for schools to either lose or gain a portion of FTE based on whether or not you're enrolling a new student from another district or a student is leaving you to go to another district. So
We got to remember, we're dealing with a different class of legislators multiple times here. So you're not dealing with the same folks that may have looked at it the same way. And you've got to take into the context of the times too, whether it was the state, whether it's the economy and what's going on at the state. So there's a lot of factors here that weigh into that. And again, probably another pitch for systemic school funding that's sustainable in a way that's not open to political whim. Either way, quite frankly, because I'm frustrated with all of it.
yeah, thank you. So on the next slide, we'll see what a potential change to the pupil membership or the funding allocation. So the proposed budget is based on that 90-10 traditional blend. That's current fall, previous spring. So there's no change there. But you'll look at the super blend, which was used for the current year. This would base 75% on this year's enrollment and pupil membership, and next year's pupil membership would be based on 25%. So for the district, that would be about a 39 FTE increase. And then the highest of the last 3 years would provide us with an additional 431 FTE using our highest pupil membership blend of 15,410.
Statewide, that has about $120 million price tag.
So if you look at what those different blends will do, we know the 90-10 traditional is about a $1.8 million use of fund balance. The super blend helps, but it's still a $1.5 million use of fund balance. And the highest of the last 3 years is a $1.8 million addition to fund balance. All right, so just continuing on with the general fund discussion. Here's the history of revenue and expenditures. You'll see in 2010-11, revenue exceeded expenditures. However, in 13 and 14, there was a use of fund balance. The 21 and 22 amounts are budgeted amounts currently and also show a use of fund balance. All right, and then general fund equity as a percent of expenditures kind of corresponds with that previous chart where you see that there was a use of fund balance and then revenues exceeded expenditures and fund balance grew. However, we're budgeting for 21 and 22 a use of fund balance, so there's a reduction in the percentage.
Just want to bear in mind, go back in history. You never like to touch fund balance if you don't have to, but it's there for a reason. If you're carrying a healthy fund balance, if we were somehow cast back in time to 2013, you wouldn't not be able to use fund balance without materially affecting the outcomes for students. That's about the level that we need to make payroll. Matt, can you just talk about that real quickly about how fund balance is used to meet those gaps when state funding doesn't come in? Because I think that's important for people to know. There are many school districts in the state of Michigan that borrow on a regular basis to make payroll because they don't have a healthy fund balance, and therefore they don't have the fund balance also to take care of dips in the market, so to speak. And that's been a commitment for this Board of Education and previous boards, and I think it's important for this organization because we can continue to provide services for kids regardless of economic times. But if you could just touch on that real quickly, I'd appreciate it.
Correct. So quickly, we don't receive our state aid for the current fiscal year until October. So October 20th or around there, depending on what day that falls on. That's the first state aid payment. So you're into your into your fiscal year. School's already started before you're technically being paid for the current school year. So in the previous districts that I worked at, we would always have to borrow to make payroll. And I believe at one time Rochester also had to borrow money to make payroll. So
Just once.
once. So, then you have interest costs and other things that are using general fund dollars to support your operations that you wouldn't necessarily needed to have in place if you had a fund balance that would allow you to avoid borrowing. But that gap in time for funding is what leads districts to borrow.
And again, that was a systemic commitment of the Board of Education to build that fund balance so they could gap those times that other districts may not be able to do that. And we can continue to serve kids because that's what we're here for.
All right, so as we look at future budgets, and we'll also look at actually future budget impacts and other considerations, again, this budget is based on a series of assumptions. Those assumptions are going to change, and many of those variables will change as well. The budgets have to work their way through the legislative process. There's proposed MEPSers or retirement costs changes, actual student enrollment, staffing levels. All of those items are going to have an impact on any budget that we present to the board, as well as the outcome of ongoing operational efficiencies, inflation, which we've already started to feel with the change order for the RHS auxiliary gym flooring that increased in the few months since it was initially awarded as we worked to correct the leak that damaged that floor. And then unemployment, which we've talked about before as well, as we have currently $16.55 an hour or $662 a week in unemployment benefits. And there are positions in the district that don't earn $16.55 an hour. Caring staffs, our paras, school age care, those items that once that unemployment ends, potentially it may be easier to staff those positions. All right, so then looking at other considerations, I mentioned this before, but last year the budget was not signed into law until September 30th. School districts are required by law to adopt a July 1st, or to adopt a budget, by July 1st. And we've hit on this throughout, but again, last year we actually saw a reduction in state aid of $175 per pupil, but was covered with a $350 per pupil increase for federal revenue or out of federal revenue. And then I would like to mention that the May Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference occurs on Friday of this week. And in January, they increased an increase of about 2.8% or $393.5 million for school aid fund revenue. So any changes there may have an impact on the proposals that are being presented by the governor, the House, and the Senate. All right, so that is it for the general fund. Next, we'll talk about the small funds. Any other questions on the general fund?
Just a comment, really. I remember, the last couple of years looking at this budget and thinking, wow, this is so complex, and never could I imagine the complexity that we are looking at the moment during COVID and post-COVID. So thank you, Matt. And I think it's, for lack of a better word to say, it's crazy that we still have to approve a budget so far before ever knowing what federal funding is or state funding is going to be. So I'm grateful for the work that you guys do to put together something that we can logically look at for the district.
I think under the Snyder administration, we got used to getting a budget on time. And that was with consolidated government where both houses of the legislature and the governor were in the same sheet of music. And I think that's something that those of us that have been doing this a little bit longer than others remember way back when, where we would get prorated into October and November, and you wouldn't get the money that you were promised. So it's certainly difficult and challenging, but it's not insurmountable. And I think if we continue to keep our focus and work together, we'll be okay.
All right, so then looking at the other funds outside of the general fund, capital projects fund budget. Again, as we mentioned earlier, we're coming to the end of Series 2 of the bond issue, and some reductions in interest and rebates based on anticipated expenditures for last year. A reduction in overall capital outlay to 11.5, 11.6 million. And then a use of fund balance for the capital projects fund of 11.6, leaving about 5.3 million that'll need to be spent by May of 23. Was it 24? May of 24. All right, debt service fund budget. Here, the district is authorized by law to levy a millage on all classes of property to service bonded debt. For us, it's Series 1 and Series 2. Mills required to service bonded debt in 21-22 are currently estimated to be 1.64 mills, or about 9.53 million in property tax revenue. We've adjusted the bond principal and interest rates based on the schedules for the Series 1 and Series 2, and increased other expense, which is, I believe, taxes abated written off. Using fund balance of almost 1.3 million, dropping fund balance to 1.3 million, or about 11.77%. We don't need to carry as large a fund balance, and really the goal is to say about 10% of fund balance, because we've paid off debt and we only have those Series 1 and Series 2, unlike what we had in 2021 where we were expending about $19 million. All right, next, as we look at the sinking fund budget, an anticipated increase in property taxes based on property values. And this is the second year of projects related to the sinking fund. Projected revenue of about 8.5 million, with projected expenditures of 9.8 million. We also have the loan principal and interest on the debt related to the DeQuinder property purchase. Using 1.9 million of fund balance, I'm estimating about 2.1 million ending fund balance, or 21.46%. Looking at 21-22 student school activity fund budgets. I think we've said it throughout, but last year, or the current year, was really not a normal year. The budgets that you'll see project a return to closer to normal operations. And because this is a newer fund, because of an accounting change, we've restored it to the levels that we saw in the actual 19-20 amounts, which was the first year. So 2.3 million in revenue and about 2.3 million in expenditures as well. All right, next we'll look at the food service fund budget. Again, return to normal, closer to normal operations. An increase in local revenue. That's the students paying for meals and a la carte items. An increase in state revenue. An increase in federal revenue because we're operating the school lunch and the school breakfast program under normal operations, so September through the end of the school year. An increase in costs as well for operating that program at the same levels as before. And building improvement budget of 350,000 to continue to spend down that fund balance to get in compliance with the regulations saying that we can only have 3 months worth of operating expenditures in the food service fund balance. We'll continue to see that until we can get fund balance down to an acceptable level. Looking at the bookstore fund budget, again, an increase here, return to closer to normal operations, 98 million in revenue, an increase of 56,000. Also 98,000 in expenditures, an increase in business, which is banking fees, which is related to debit card and credit card transactions. That platform seemed to be popular this year and looks like it'll continue to be. So anticipated increase there. And revenue and expenditures offset, so no change to fund balance. All right, our last budget, 21-22 Caring Steps Fund budget. As you know, we have a large waiting list. So we anticipate that we'll capture about 75% of those students or those FTEs on the waiting list in 21-22, which will equate to almost 1.2 million in tuition revenue. Also some related increases to staffing to support those additional students, as well as food costs, and then some small 2% increases throughout most of the rest of the budget. Meaning a transfer from the general fund of 117,000 compared to the 280,000 that we're proposing for the end or for the final budget of 2021. All
Matt,
right, and that,
Matt,
yes.
I'm sorry, just on the caring steps, just a quick question on there. I know we're concerned because of the unemployment and the additional funding that they get, and you said that goes through mid-September?
I believe it ends September 4th.
So I guess my question is, because a lot of times people are looking for childcare that starts on a school year basis potentially. So have we looked at ways to get these people in early enough so that we are able to, guarantee spots for people who are on the wait list for the beginning of the school year?
Yeah, I mean, we're continually hiring right now. I believe Brittany provided an update last week that she was able to hire 2 additional staff members to help get students off the waiting list. I think Corey told me this morning that we've actually been able to remove some additional or move some additional students from that wait list to actual start dates. So there's positive trends that we're seeing right now with Caring Steps, and we'll continue to work with Corey and Brittany and Courtney and work to find a solution to get staff hired and in place. As you mentioned, July and August are not, enrollment is less in July and August because it's summer and there's vacations and whatnot. But yeah, prepping for an increase in September is something that we're looking towards, as well as other timeframes where we may see additional increases. I'm not sure if January might be another time frame where we would see an opportunity to add many additional students off that wait list.
Other questions or comments?
I was just going to say, Matt, I know when we talked about this budget, we had talked about baking in like a 2 to 3% tuition increase to help offset, hopefully bringing on more staff that could accommodate the higher FTE to make sure that, we're accommodating everybody who's on the wait list. So I'm glad to see that that's baked in.
Yes, yep, that's a good point, that there is a tuition increase baked in to the budget.
I was just gonna make a comment here. I like shooting guns, and when you shoot at something that's moving, it's very difficult if you've never done it. And you're doing that at an extreme level. And I think that there's some things that a lot of people might not understand how difficult that is. Just went through a merger and acquisition, very complicated, complex, a lot of pitfalls. And from what I've seen through that and what you and your team have done in regards to this, I think you've done a hell of a job with it. Of course, it could change tomorrow, has been stated multiple times, and that's, of course, it's just part of the territory right now. Other thing I think is good is you and your team communicate well. I work with people all the time, and, that are experts in different spaces than I am. And what happens is they're really good at what they do. You've all probably run into this at work. They're not very good at articulating things in a way that you can understand. If that's not a space that you live and swim in all day long. I think you guys did a good job of that as well. Another thing that I always appreciate with what your team does with the numbers is you err on the side of conservatism with it. We're not out there getting cute with this. Again, the moving targets are there, but I appreciate the assumptions being as conservative as they are as well with all of this. So just appreciate the hard work, because I know it's not been easy for you working your butt off on this thing. So just wanted to recognize that.
Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate both the attention that the board has paid to this presentation as well as questions. And we'll continue to adjust as new information arises. But this is where we stand now, and it may be, we may be in a completely different place tomorrow. But this is the best we have for today and tonight. And we have until June. I believe it's June 21st is when we'll bring the budget for formal approval, and we'll see what we know then. It may be not much more than we know now, but we'll make adjustments accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Matt.
it.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. Dana, thank you.
Appreciate everyone who stuck with us. Next item on the agenda is citizens present at the meeting. I have 4 cards. If anyone wishes to speak, please fill out a yellow card and hand it in on one of the ends here, and we will make sure that we get it. If you want to just hand it to Scott or Michelle, they'll pass it down. And if you can please come to this microphone to speak, that'd be great. First, I have Tara Donnelly. Kevin, can you or Mike move the monitor here? Thanks. 1 second.
I don't even know. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, good.
All right.
Let me know when I can.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Tara Donnelly, and I'm a parent in Rochester. Tonight, I'm here to discuss my concerns about the leaky roof at Longmeadow. I understand that there was work being scheduled on the roof this June, but it is not a complete roof replacement. The part of the roof that covers the majority of the classrooms is being reseamed instead of replaced. Teachers and students spend the majority of their time in these classrooms, so I don't understand why RCS isn't completely replacing the roof instead of just patching it up. In 2015, the taxpayers voted to approve a $185 million bond in good faith that what was promised would be what was delivered. Of that $185 million, $2.1 million was earmarked for Longmeadow's critical needs. A leaky roof was identified as a critical need in 2015. A critical need was defined as an issue that had to be addressed within 3 years of identification. So why didn't RCS use that earmarked bond money to completely replace the Longmeadow roof between 2015 and 2018? Holding off on a new roof replacement has given rise to a host of conditions that could have been avoided had RCS used the bond money as intended and replaced the roof in a timely manner. Since 2015, Longmeadow's roof has deteriorated to the point that there are buckets in the hallway to catch the water anytime it rains. There is no reason for this since we had the money to replace the roof. In addition, several community members have expressed concerns about mold, mildew, and air quality issues in Longmeadow. Mold can cause serious health issues, particularly in students with asthma or allergies. If mold can fester in a humid bathroom after just 7 days, then how much mold is festering in Longmeadow with a roof that's been leaking for 6 years? I urge RCS to consider its moral imperative and address the potentially hazardous health conditions that can arise from a leaking roof by taking the following actions. First, hire an independent company to check Longmeadow's air quality and conduct an inspection for mold, mildew, and water accumulation. Second, replace the entire roof at Longmeadow instead of just kicking the can down the road with a patch-up job. Third, mandate regular building inspections by Longmeadow's, sorry, I'm like fogging up over here. Mandate regular building inspections by Longmeadow's facilities management team and make that information available to the public. Thank you for your attention to this matter and have a good evening.
Thank you. Leah Raymond.
Good evening, Dr. Shaner, Rochester Board of Education. My name is Leah Raymond. I am a Rochester student and a student at the International Academy. I am not a member of one of your 3 main high schools, but I am concerned for your students. Those who are in quarantine for a week, maybe 2 weeks after a COVID exposure are not getting the education that they deserve or that they require. There is no access to the classrooms for the students. So they cannot engage with their teachers, with their fellow students in the classroom education that they should be receiving in Rochester Community Schools. This really does represent the disparity in the education that I receive versus what my sister receives at Adams High School. At the International Academy, everybody Zooms into the classrooms. If they are home quarantined, then they have the option to come in if they are, or Zoom in if they are healthy enough. If they would prefer to stay home, they will Zoom into the classrooms. And they are able to interact with the teachers in this way. It is wonderful. They can work with their peers. They can ask questions because this is the fundamental part of education that every student needs, and it is absolutely irreplaceable. Now, the IA zooms in, other high schools zoom in. This is obviously not illegal, and you all know that. Dr. Shaner, you told my sister herself in her own high school that it's not illegal, and yet the students come home every day. My sister comes home and she says the teachers are not aware that they are allowed to live stream their classrooms. Now, what happens when a student is at home? You're making it exponentially harder for them to learn. They cannot engage with the teachers. They cannot ask questions in class and get them answered on time. And then it is impossible to learn as the teachers will post their materials, sometimes videos of lectures, sometimes notes, other times nothing, on various platforms spread throughout. There is no central area for a teacher to post something. This is inequality of education. This is not what you pride yourselves in. An equal education for everybody is not what the students are receiving. And when you do not inform your teachers that they are able to live stream their classrooms, this is active discrimination against a significant portion of your student body, specifically high schoolers. 200 to 400 of these high schoolers are home quarantined without this proper access to education. They are preparing for AP tests, SATs, college applications, and you are doing them no favors. I urge you, RCS board, please do better for your students.
Thank you. Joshua Raymond. Thank you, Leah. Joshua Raymond.
Oh, I hate following her.
She is very well spoken. You should be very proud of her.
Thank you. My name is Joshua Raymond, and I've got 3 daughters, Adams, IA, and Avondale Gate. First, I want to start off with Open Meetings Act, Section 3.4. A person must not be required as a condition of attendance at a meeting of a public body to register or otherwise provide his or her name or other information or otherwise to fulfill a condition precedent to attendance. So I presume that next meeting, that sign-in sheet will not be here and you will not be violating the Open Meetings Act again. So on to the main thing. What will be your legacy? As a Board of Education trustee, do you ever ask yourself that? What will it have meant for you to sit on the school board for 6 or more years? What group of students did you fight for and improve their services and programs? What improvement to the district did you champion? What perspective did you have that changed the course of education here? Who have you challenged to step up for our kids and their learning? When have you put yourself out there and said a change is needed? When have you taken parents' concerns and said at a meeting, these parents are right, we have to fix this? When have you said to the superintendent, this isn't enough, come back at the next meeting with more? Unanimous voting is not a legacy. Anyone can do that. Supporting the superintendent is not your legacy. That is Dr. Shaner's legacy. Not asking tough questions is not a legacy. No one is remembered fondly for being a pushover. I call it your legacy, but really, Your legacy is about our kids. It is our kids who need you to make the most of being a trustee and make the most of your legacy. I'm proud of my legacy in education. I worked with parents, educators, and administrators to create an amazing school. I'm proud of my legacy in the community. My subdivision is safer with the pathways that I worked with Rochester Hills government to get added. I don't consider my legacy over, though. I will continue to improve our schools and our community. If you will not have a legacy, step down. If your legacy is already complete, resign. We have parents and community members eager to make positive changes in our schools. They would gladly step into your trustee positions so that RCS can become even better. Continuing to stay on the board while not fighting for improvements is only standing in their way. Move forward or move aside. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie Van Dale.
My name is Stephanie Van Dale, and you know what my relationship is to the district? Taxpayer. Each one of you deserve to be recalled. Some of you cannot because of state law. If you cannot tell, many in this room do not like the choices you have unanimously made. Many of us are here for different reasons. The new admin building, caring steps, literacy, live streaming, quarantine protocols, Long Meadow roof, bullying atmosphere, and the board being sued by a concerned parent. But one thing unites us all, our increasing disappointment with all of you. You do nothing to lower the temperature in this room. You don't get together. You don't do any of this coffee stuff. You do nothing. You just sit there. This board has one chance to get this right, but I do not think you are up to the task. So please step aside so that we, the people, can elect other people who are up to the task. Thank you.
Jessica Opfer.
Hi, me again. I think I don't need to introduce myself again. I have some additional comments I want to make tonight. First, I submitted a number of questions in the board packet that have not yet received a response. And I just want to point out that I did not ask those questions just for myself. I asked them on behalf of many people who share my concerns. I know a lot of people are afraid to speak up because they don't want to be identified publicly and fear retribution. That goes not just for parents, but for teachers and staff as well, which is pretty unfortunate. For the record, I'm requesting written responses to those questions so that the information can be shared with the public. Second, I would like to report out on an informal survey we conducted recently in the RCS Agents for Change Facebook group. We asked our members about the issues that concern them the most in our school district. The answers that rose to the top included transparency and communication, a formal plan for educating quarantine students, concerns about the district's budget and spending, the new administration building purchase, feeling heard by the board and administrators, and a culture of intimidation towards parents and teachers. Sound familiar? I don't want to be here talking about communication failures and questionable financial decisions. I want to be here talking about the items that showed up next in the survey, like smaller class sizes, later school start times, concerns about our literacy, reading, and math curriculums, the gifted, magnet, and IB programs parents have been asking for years, the removal of middle school advanced language arts, an issue that's near and dear to my heart, the need for increased recess time in the lower grades, and many more. These are the programs and services that attract families to our district and keep them here. And I'll also point out that spending $5 million in public funds on a childcare facility also showed up really high on our list of concerns. Demonstrating true leadership means listening to your constituents, thinking outside of the box, and acting on improvements, opportunities for improvement. But until we resolve the systemic communication failures revealed this year, we will never be able to move forward on the issues that really matter to our children's education. This district needs to stop resting on its past laurels and see this past year as a wake-up call. As I said before, we can do better. Thank you.
Julie Stalker.
Hi, I am Julie Stalker. I'm interested in improving literacy and increasing dyslexia awareness. People with dyslexia do not see letters backwards or out of order. It is not a vision problem. It's neurological and it makes reading more difficult. Dyslexia has no relationship to intelligence. Stephen Hawking had dyslexia. But whether or not you are effectively taught to read can drastically impact your perception of your own intelligence and self-esteem. 70 to 80% of struggling readers have dyslexia. It's more common than you think. 20% of the population has dyslexia. That's 1 in 5. This is an everybody concern. All 3 of RCS's Gen Ed reading programs use the same approach, which is not effective for dyslexia. But most struggling readers have dyslexia. So RCS is delaying giving them an intervention that would help them and is prolonging their suffering. Just as reading is the most researched topic in education, dyslexia is the most studied learning disability. Staff and parents gathered here in the Harrison Room in 2018 to learn about dyslexia from a local psychologist and expert. Last year, I completed 100 hours of professional development, learning some neuroscience, more about dyslexia, and a reading intervention that incorporates multiple approaches to teaching reading, including Orton-Gillingham or structured literacy, Lindemood-Bell, and even whole language. I am not an educator nor an expert on dyslexia or reading. Dyslexia affects 20% of your students, 3,000 students. Do you have a dyslexia department? Dyslexia specialists, CALTs, CALPs, teachers certified in structured literacy methods. When you don't teach kids to read proficiently, it has real consequences. Kids feel stupid, they get depressed, and they're more likely to drop out of school. 40% of prisoners are dyslexic. But dyslexia has advantages too. According to the American Management Association, 35% of entrepreneurs are dyslexic. If you improve your reading interventions, you might save lives and futures. Maybe you can help fill boardrooms instead of prisons. It takes 5 things to close the gap in reading for students with dyslexia. The right program, which is strong and complete phonics-based Orton-Gillingham or structured literacy program, a teacher with professional in-depth training, the right sized group, the right number of hours each week, the right length of time until the program has been completed. To be effective, programs must be used with fidelity, which means as required by the developer of that program, or you will not get the expected results. Allowing a student with a hidden disability like dyslexia to struggle academically or socially when all that is needed for success are appropriate accommodations and explicit instruction is no different than failing to provide a ramp for a person in a wheelchair. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Deanna Harless.
Good evening. My name is Deanna Harless, and I'm a member of the community and former RCS parent. I think everyone would agree that this has been a very hard year for everyone. All of you were put in positions to make decisions that you never have been trained for. Board members were asked to vote for proposals and decisions that I'm sure you never expected when deciding to apply for board positions. And as parents, we were advocating for our children, and we've been in a tough spot as well, because to be honest, it has felt at times like we are the only ones advocating for our children. There will always be disagreement on choices made. That isn't the issue that so many parents are facing. I don't think there's anything any of you could do that would please 100% of the community, but that's not the issue. The issue is the lack of clear communication. Parents shouldn't worry about if they speak up to the school board, what the repercussions will be for them, their job, or their children. Even during the last board meeting, when we were speaking, it really felt like 3 out of 5 of the board members present were more interested in timing our comments than listening to our comments. It's really disheartening as a parent and as a community member. And I think while we all realize we're in unprecedented times, all we're asking for is an opportunity to be heard, responses that aren't filtered through the district's PR firm, an open dialogue with you, our elected representatives. So even if we don't agree, we feel heard and that you care about the best interests of our children. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Sandy Fiascetti.
Hello, you guys know who I am, but I'm a parent in the district today. And I was going to talk to you about probability theory, but it's late and we're tired, so I wanted to do it through a story. And let's say I wanted to give an apple to every parent of every student. There's 15,000 students, some are blended families. Maybe I need a warehouse of 40,000 apples, let's say. I like sweet apples, but I'm going to put some Granny Smith in. If some bad actor went to my warehouse and took a bag purposely of all the sour apples and brought them to you week after week, you might think, my gosh, that warehouse is full of sour apples. I want you to remember that warehouse is brimming with tens of thousands of sweet apples.
Thank you. Members of the administration.
Thank you, Madam President. If I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I just want to make a shout out to our high schools who had their senior walk today. There are many school districts that are not able to do that for various reasons. One of the reasons we can do it is we push to get back to school as quickly as we could. Is 5 days a week. So today we had an in-person senior walk for each and every senior that wanted to participate and their parents, and it was fantastic. And I really want to shout out to the administrators and the teachers and even the kids and the parents that were there. It was, for me personally, it was very emotional, as you might imagine. But it was fantastic, and I just wanted to say thank you. I also just really quickly, a lot of talk about the Longmeadow roof, and I just want to clear just a couple of things up. Longmeadow is on the sinking fund list for this summer. We don't design roofs. Engineers do, and engineering firms. And I assure everyone that's concerned about the Longmeadow roof that we'll have a deep dive of the engineering firm into that and review their recommendations. Furthermore, Longmeadow has been checked for air quality multiple times, and as far as we know at this point, with an independent environmental consultant, that the air quality inside of Longmeadow is better than the outdoor air quality. But I want to just go back again to we're winding down the school year. I wouldn't believe it, but there's 15 instructional days left. We said goodbye to our seniors today, and it's been a very difficult year on everyone. And I would just ask each and every one of you to just reach out and thank an educator, thank our staff, our teachers. Many of you pointed out that we've done many things in committee and will continue to do that. We appreciate that. And I also want to acknowledge people's frustration. I don't think I've met a person in society these days that's not frustrated about something, whether it's mask, no mask, maybe a mask. Maybe it's quarantine rules, whether it's at work, whether I'm going back to work in person, whether I'm going to work 3 days a week or 2 days a week from home. Everyone's frustrated. And I just would ask that we all take a deep breath. It's our fervent hope that we're back to normalcy next school year. We announced that today, that we expect to have a 6-period day in secondary. And we also want to let you all know that elementary school is as close in terms of scheduling as normal can be because of the cohorting that works out, and it just makes it easier. But really, our gratitude to the community, our gratitude to our staff, our gratitude to our amazing team of people that have done an incredible job in incredibly difficult times. And what you see is what you get. We've got really talented people that care a lot about your kids, and we're focused on serving them. So again, gratitude to the community, gratitude to our staff, gratitude to this Board of Education and the amazing group of administrators that I'm blessed to work with every day. And today at Rochester High, where I was, couldn't have been a better day. I had a great day today. I got to read to kindergarten kids, and then I got to do the senior walk at Rochester High School and remind us of our compelling why, which we certainly need in these times. Thank you.
Thank you. Any board member comments? Michelle?
Yes, I just wanted to let you know that Rochester Area Youth Assistance, although the year is kind of winding down, is still working on some enrichments for parents. So last week they did hold a presentation for parents of elementary students, and it provided tools for dealing with anxiety in their children. And it was a wonderful presentation, and it was put on by RCS school psychologist Caroline Rowe and Dan Pride and social worker Andrew McNeely. And they did a great job. And hopefully that will be up shortly, so anyone who was not able to watch it can tune in and see that. But we also have tomorrow, in partnership with the Rochester Hills Public Library, there is they're hosting the Becoming Mindful and Resilient in the Age of Anxiety. And that is by Dr. Chris Willard, a psychologist and mindfulness expert. He'll be presenting, and you can still register. It's tomorrow night at 7 p.m. and you can register at the rhpl.org website. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Kevin?
Actually, Michelle, I wanted to not really add on to that, but Raya is just relentless in their support, for our kids and our family, our families, and nonprofits, have been hit super, super hard in all this also. So I just wonder if you might be able to pass on gratitude for hanging tough and not letting their mission slide at all. If you could pass that on, that'd be great.
I will certainly do that. And I know, like, the school district has experienced, they've had some great turnout with using the Zoom, because people have been able to attend from home and not head out to another building. And it's, I think it's some items that they might be able to utilize in the future as well.
Go ahead, Barb.
I just wanted to touch on what Bob was saying. It felt like there was some semblance of normalcy because I got to attend the recent Excellence in Education Awards. The P&O Insurance Agency has always has been supporting for years the district in awarding and recognizing the outstanding educators, staff, and individuals within our district. And so I got to attend a presentation at ACE for a virtual academy teacher that was awarded the presentation for excellence in education. And then also at McGregor Elementary for a pre-K teacher that was also awarded the Excellence in Education Award. And one thing that she said, this particular pre-K teacher, when she accepted her award, was her ability to feel so fortunate and grateful that she could teach and touch children whose lives really need it, but it's something that she's so passionate about, and she gets to do what she loves every day. And it was so genuine, and she was truly surprised. So it was great to be there and be a part of that. And then, of course, the honors convocations that I attended with various of you, those are always great to see. And resiliency is, I think, something that we definitely saw at each one of those honor convocations, to see how our students have excelled in a year of COVID. So it was a good week.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, it's been a long year, right? I think we've all said that. It's been a super long meeting. I actually want to thank those of you in the audience who came tonight, and thank you to those who spoke. And, you know, I don't think I've ever seen an audience at all for a budget work session because they go till 10:30 at night. You know, in my board time, the room is empty often. And, you know, if anything in the midst of, you know, where we disagree and where we agree and where we misunderstand and where we don't know what to do next, as a community and as parents in um, such a year that gave us so many uncertainties. I think that I value the fact that what has come to the surface is more people who are willing to sit in a board meeting and learn about what our budget is. Because at the core of our work is making sure that we have what we need to teach kids. And so I'm grateful for the folks who are here and the folks who are watching at home. We, you know, there used to be one or two. I think there are a lot more of you now. So so thank you, parents, and thank you for having the passion for your students and being able to carry that through. And I think we will continue to be able to move forward in positive ways if we keep this momentum in a positive way as we move into the next school year.
Thanks. I have a few comments. I'll mix them with announcements. We have proms this week, following up on some of the senior activities we talked about. May 22nd is the Sparkle Awards, I believe, at Stony Creek at 4 p.m. That's a really special event where we honor some heroes in the special education world here for RCS. Next week is Authors in April. Thank you to the PTA Council and all of the PTAs and the support, all of the literacy specialists and teachers for supporting that. And our next meeting is at 7 p.m. June 7th. And I just wanted to follow up, Dr. Shaner, what you described today. I was privileged to attend a senior walk today. And it's a tradition we have at RCS. If you haven't had a senior, you might not be aware of it. If you haven't had a high schooler, I don't know that every school district does this. The students have one last chance to walk through their halls. Pomp and circumstances played. It's for a lot of them. It's you know, they're wearing their cap and gown or their gown for the first time. Every student in the school is clapping them out, and they meet their families on the football field. And so, I mean, you say this all the time, Dr. Shaner, we're in the business of hope and inspiration. I want to remind my board colleagues that, and I had a front row seat to that today. And when I think about legacy, that's what I think about is these students. And so this particular ceremony I was at was really special. The seniors actually nominated 3 teachers that they wanted to give them send-off advice remarks. So the teachers gave them advice. And so shout out to Mr. McFarland and Mr. Porter, Mr. Mack, as he's known. I took some notes and I'm just going to read a few things that they had to say to these seniors today. They told them to be genuine, have fun, be compassionate, be loyal, be the change. Be a person driven by love. Love who you are. Love the life passion that you commit to every day. Love the others around you. Love is the most powerful tool. And I'll just end with this. And this is all props to Mr. Porter. Never forget this is your home. And this was his message to the seniors today. Never forget this is your home. Like any community, it's not always perfect, but we will always be here for you no matter where your next adventure may lead. So we do have one more meeting before we send our seniors off, but I can't say congratulations to this class enough. So with that, I'll call for an adjournment at, looks like is it 10:35? 10:35. Motion to adjourn. Moved by Mike, seconded by Michelle. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye.